Okay, it is 6 p.m. So welcome everyone. Hope everyone is having a good day and a good evening. Welcome to week number 6 for PPA 500. As you all know, this is our final week together. So as you also know, we have two main topics left to cover in this course: the management of human resources and the management of financial resources. So we'll see how we progress tonight. The plan is, if we are able to get through all of that information this evening, then we won't have a need to meet on Saturday. And so you can use that time on Saturday to finish up your final assessment, as well as finishing up Canvas essay number 5 and those responses to classmates. Canvas essay 5 and the responses, along with your final assessment, those assignments are due, as you know, by 11:59 p.m. on Saturday, April 15th. If for some reason we are not able to get through both of these topics tonight, we'll do the first half of class on management of human resources, the second half on management of fiscal resources. If we're not able to get through management of fiscal resources, then we'll have to finish that information up in our session on Saturday. And if that's the case, then I will move the due date for the final assessment back a couple of days to give you time to be able to answer that scenario on the management of fiscal resources. However, I think we're in pretty good shape, and I don't really see any reason why we cannot get through all of our information tonight and then just leave Saturday for time for you to finish up your final assessment in Canvas essay number 5. Speaking of the Canvas essays, thank you for Canvas essay number 4. Again, I've already seen those answers because those are answers you provided on the midterm assessment. So that's why I didn't provide feedback in terms of Canvas essay number 4. The whole purpose was just to allow you the opportunity to share your responses with your classmates and then to get feedback from your classmates on your position of whether or not public administration is truly a discipline or if it is a subfield within political science. Your final Canvas essay number 5, which is due on Saturday, looks at public policy. And so what you'll do for this one is you're going to identify a public policy that you are interested in or a public policy that you are familiar with, and then discuss the type of decision-making model that was used in the formulation of that public policy. And last week, we talked about several decision-making models. We talked about rational comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and the garbage can model of decision-making. So which of those decision-making models do you feel was most prevalent in the formulation of this public policy that you're discussing? And then if there is another decision-making model that you think may have worked better, what decision-making model do you think would have been more appropriate? And so that's Canvas essay number 5, due by 11:59 p.m. on Saturday, April 15th. We had talked about the final assessment last week as well, and I took you through all the scenarios on that final assessment. So the two pieces of information we have left: management of human resources and management of fiscal resources. So if everything goes well tonight, then you will have all the information that you need for all 5 of those scenarios on the final assessment. So that is the plan moving forward. Once you are done with this class, then on Saturday, and Saturday is our official last day of this course schedule, then you'll have 2 weeks off. And then on April 29th, you will move into your second course in the program, which is PPA 535, Public Budgeting and Finance. That course is taught by Dr. Scott Williams, and he's been teaching that course in the DL program now for, I think, the past 3 or 4 cohorts. He does a really nice job of blending both the academic as well as the practical side of the house together in that course. Dr. Williams has a doctorate in public administration, so he has the academic credentials, but he is also a city finance director. He's been a city finance director for many, many years now, was city finance director in the city of San Bernardino. And I believe he's currently the city finance director for the city of Signal Hill. So he has a great deal of practical experience that he marries very well with the academic approach to give you a nice holistic view of public budgeting and finance, especially at the local government level. So I'm sure you'll enjoy that course. I'm sure you'll get a lot out of that course. I've been in touch with Dr. Williams, and he's putting the final touches on the course as we speak. And so he will have the syllabus ready to go in very short order, and we'll make sure that Geraldine gets that syllabus out to you before the course starts. So that's your next course coming up, starting on April 29th, Public Budgeting and Finance. Okay. Are there any questions or concerns or anything before we get into our topics for the evening?
I have a question in regards to the second course.
Sure, go ahead.
So it starts on April 29th. Are we going to be receiving an email about I know the program, someone registers us. I was just thinking when are we going to get the email to pay for the tuition?
Yeah, you'll get that email from Matt Reimers in CPACE as soon as this course is over. So I would assume probably by next Monday, you'll get that email from Matt, and he'll go ahead, he'll register everyone in the course, and then he'll handle all the registration issues then. I believe it'll probably be next Monday is when you get that email.
Okay, and one other question, what is the course number?
Course is PPA 555.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. And again, yeah, once you get into 555 public budgeting and finance, then that's one of our main core courses in the program. And so that's where you start to acquire some of the information that you will then need later on when you get to 697 and you're completing those 5 case studies. The first case study in 697 is that public budgeting and finance case study. And so you'll get the information from 555 to then allow you to be able to do that case study. When that time comes, we're not there yet. You're not going to be registering for 697 until summer of 2024. So that's kind of on the horizon out in the future a little bit. But I think you'll enjoy the course, get a lot of good practical information about how we manage budgets and finances, especially at the local level of government. So where we are currently oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about for the final assessment 4B about the 4 models of organizational effectiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Did I miss that when we went over that, or I've been having some difficulty finding it in the textbook?
Yeah, those are the 4 models we talked about in our last session. Those are things such as the goal attainment model, the systems resource model, the participant satisfaction model, and the internal process model. Those 4 models we present in class. They're not covered in your textbook. That's some of that additional information that you get from class that Kettle really doesn't talk a whole lot about in his textbook. But those are the 4: goal attainment, systems resource, participant satisfaction, and internal process models.
I may have to go back to the last lecture on YouTube.
Yeah, and I could just say really quickly, I can go over those very quickly for you. The goal attainment model of effectiveness is where we measure effectiveness in terms of how well we've achieved the goals and the objectives of either the organization or a policy or a program. Such a very straightforward type of approach. That's usually how we measure effectiveness. We are effective if we've achieved our goals. The problem with the goal attainment model is sometimes our goals in the public sector are not terribly clear. Sometimes they're more qualitative, sometimes they're a bit more subjective in nature than what we tend to see over in the private sector. So sometimes it's difficult for us to truly assess whether or not we have achieved or to what degree we have achieved our goals. So a second way in which we measure effectiveness is systems resource. And that's the ability to pull in resources from our surrounding environment. So if we're measuring the effectiveness of an organization, we would determine an organization to be effective if it has successfully brought in resources such as a skilled labor force, or in terms of revenue or political support. Those are all resources we're bringing into our organization, and those could also then be indicators of effectiveness, especially if we cannot measure our goals very clearly. Then the third model of effectiveness is participant satisfaction. This is how well are we meeting the wants, needs, and desires of our key constituents, of our stakeholders. So are our citizens happy with the services that they're receiving, both the amount as well as the quality of the services? Are elected officials happy with what we are doing as an organization, or what this policy or this program is providing? So how well are you keeping these people, these key stakeholders, satisfied? And these key stakeholders can be outside the organization in terms of elected officials or members of the public, or they could also be within the organization in terms of your employees. You're looking internal to the organization at how satisfied your employees are. You are kind of doing a human resource type of an approach, in that if you can keep your employees satisfied, they're less likely to leave the organization. They're more likely to be incentivized to be productive in doing their jobs. But participant satisfaction, how satisfied are those constituencies with what we are doing? Then the fourth model is the internal process model. And that approach to effectiveness, we will consider an organization effective if all the processes within the organization are working in harmony. And so do you have a teamwork type of atmosphere, a team spirit within your organization? Do you have congruence between the goals of individuals and goals of the organization? So what you're basically looking at with the internal process models, you're looking for indicators of organizational harmony within the organization as the indicator of effectiveness. And the whole reason why we talk about those four models of effectiveness is just to give you an idea that it's sometimes more about just than accomplishing goals. That if we can't measure effectiveness through the accomplishment of goals, we have these three additional ways of measuring effectiveness that we can fall back upon: systems resource, participant satisfaction, and internal process models. So hopefully that's helpful. Those are those four models. I think we did it right at the very end of class last week, but those are those four models I'm talking about when I'm talking about models of organizational effectiveness.
Thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. Okay, so for tonight, where we are at now is essentially the last few weeks, we have really focused on what we do in public administration and what we do as public administrators. And so when we talked about organization theory, we were talking about how we manage our organizations to try and make our organizations as effective and as efficient as possible. So as public administrators, we spend a lot of time managing the operations of our organization. But as public administrators, we also spend time involved in policy formulation, policy implementation, and policy evaluation. And so we talked about those functions then last week. And then in addition to that, then we also focus on evaluating public programs. And so we spend some of our time evaluating these public programs to, again, see how effective we are implementing these programs, how efficient these programs are, how well these programs contribute to our other values of public administration, such as social justice, representative bureaucracy, protection of individual rights. And so we do a lot of program evaluation. The organization theory information you will get in your 660 course, which you will have with me. Then you'll get your policy information, more of that in 670 with Dr. Matthews. And then you get more program evaluation information later on in 696 with our current department chair, Dr. Butts. Then two additional areas of focus for public administrators obviously will be how well we can manage public resources, such as human resources, as well as fiscal resources. The management of human resources is what you will get in your 577 course with Dr. Ed Martin. And then management of fiscal resources, obviously you will get in your next class with Dr. Williams in PPA 555. So let's talk about how we manage human as well as fiscal resources. First half of class tonight, we'll deal with the management of human resources. Second half of class, we'll deal with the management of fiscal resources. But to best understand how we manage human resources in the public sector, we need to understand where we have been versus where we are in terms of public employment. So who do we hire to work in the public sector, and on what basis do we decide who gets hired into a federal agency or a state or local agency versus who does not get hired into those positions? So in terms of the people we have hired, the human resources that we have brought into the public sector, we have seen a development or an evolution in terms of the basis that we use to determine who gets hired into the public sector, who gets to be these public administrators. And the three basic eras, if you will, the three basic periods of public employment are the era of gentlemen, the era of spoils, and the era of merit. So at the outset of the country, when we were first just a fledgling nation, we had to try and achieve some legitimacy in the eyes of the people. You know, again, today we think about the federal government. We're going to go to bed tonight. We're going to get up in the morning. The federal government's going to be there. It has much more permanency today than it did in the late 1700s. There were valid concerns about just how permanent and how well this new national government could survive. So in order to add legitimacy to this new national government, we tended to hire people based upon who they were. In the era of gentlemen, running from the founding of the country up until 1828, we were hiring people based upon who they were. We were hiring these people who came from the quote unquote best family backgrounds, the best social backgrounds, the best educational backgrounds, what were known at the time as gentlemen. And again, we were hiring these people to add legitimacy to the national government. So you got your job based upon who you were. We had this election in 1824 that I think we mentioned earlier in an earlier session called the corrupt bargain. In the presidential election of 1824, we had multiple candidates running for the presidency. We had John Quincy Adams, we had Andrew Jackson, we had Henry Clay, and we had William Crawford. We had four major candidates. Well, not surprisingly, when you have more than two candidates running, there's a high probability that no one is going to get a majority of the votes in the Electoral College. And that's what happened in 1824. Andrew Jackson got more popular votes than any of the other candidates and got more electoral votes than any of the other candidates. Unfortunately for Jackson, he did not get a majority of the Electoral College votes. And with our reading of the Constitution, we know that the way in which our Electoral College works is that if no one gets a majority of votes in the Electoral College, the election then goes into the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives then chooses a president, with each congressional delegation having one vote. So irrespective of the size of that congressional delegation, every state delegation only gets one vote. And the state delegations vote, you get a majority of state delegations supporting you, you then get to be elected president by the House of Representatives. When the election went into the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay worked out a deal by which Henry Clay would get his states to throw their support behind John Quincy Adams, and in return, John Quincy Adams would then appoint Henry Clay to a cabinet position, specifically as Secretary of State. So Henry Clay had his state supporters throw their support behind John Quincy Adams. That then provided enough votes for John Quincy Adams to win the presidency in the House of Representatives. Shortly thereafter, after John Quincy Adams assumed the presidency the following March, he came through on his promise and he appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State. That's what came to be known as the corrupt bargain. Because of that quote unquote corrupt bargain, we then had a rematch 4 years later in 1828. And in the rematch in 1828, Andrew Jackson won both the popular as well as the electoral vote and got a majority of both popular as well as electoral votes. By winning a majority of electoral vote in 1828, Andrew Jackson becomes president. And when he comes into the presidency, he brings with him his own idea about how we fill positions in the federal bureaucracy. For Andrew Jackson, it was to the victor go the spoils. So the winning candidate, the winning political party, should then have the ability to hand out these positions in the federal government as a thank you to people who helped him and helped his party get elected to the presidency. That obviously became known then as the era of spoils or the era of patronage. Again, really starting in after the election of 1828. So instead of selecting people to work in the federal bureaucracy based upon who they were, in the era of spoils, we were selecting people based upon who they knew. Did they support the winning candidate? Did they support the winning political party? Whenever you are picking people for positions in government, not based upon who they are or what they know, you're picking them based upon who they know. There is obviously the opportunity for a lot of corruption, a lot of misfeasance, a lot of malfeasance. And we saw a lot of that corruption and a lot of that mal and misfeasance all throughout the 1800s. And this is the period of time where we saw the rise of all these political machines in our major cities. And so Tammany Hall, for instance, in New York, we have political machines dominating Boston, political machines dominating Chicago. So we have the rise of all these political machines, and these political machines were all based upon this era of spoils, that they were giving out jobs to their supporters. This is why George Washington Plunkett, who worked in Tammany Hall in New York City, in his memoirs, talked about how important it was for young people, and that time he referred to it as young men, because those are the people who were getting jobs in the federal government and state and local government, for young men to, instead of going to college, young men should go out there and support candidates. They should learn how to round up votes, because if you can round up votes and get somebody elected, then your reward will then be a job in government. So obviously, if we're hiring people based upon not what they know, but based upon who they know, we've got all this corruption that's going on throughout the 1800s. Because of this corruption, in the 1850s and the 1860s into the 1870s, we had municipal leagues around the country that were starting to kick around the idea of, we really should start hiring people based upon merit as opposed to hiring people based upon who they knew and which political party they supported. But we didn't really have the galvanizing event. We didn't really have the triggering event that would move us from the era of spoils into the era of merit. And that triggering event didn't occur until the assassination of President Garfield in 1881. So in the election of 1880, James Garfield wins the presidency. But a year into his presidency, he was then assassinated by a man named Charles J. Guiteau. And Charles J. Guiteau assassinated Garfield because he felt he was owed a job from the Garfield administration. Charles J. Guiteau was an interesting individual. He had written some campaign speeches for then candidate Garfield. There's no indication, no evidence that Garfield used any of those speeches or even knew who Charles J. Guiteau was. There's no evidence of any relationship there at all. But Guiteau felt that he had helped Garfield get elected to the presidency, and so therefore he should get a plum position in the federal government. The position he really yearned for was to be ambassador to France. So, he really shot for the stars with a high-profile position. He did not get a position, and so Guiteau, in kind of his warped sense of reality, thought that if he assassinated Garfield, Garfield's vice president, Chester Arthur, was a big supporter of the idea of patronage and spoils. So if he assassinated James Garfield, then Chester Arthur would then ascend to the presidency. And when Chester Arthur ascended to the presidency, because he was a big believer in the era of spoils, Chester Arthur would then give him the job that he was looking for. So it's kind of in his mind, it was a rational way of getting his position. So Charles Guiteau assassinates Garfield. Guiteau did not get a job in the Arthur administration, and for his troubles, Guiteau ended up getting executed for the assassination of President Garfield. But that was a triggering event that really galvanized public opinion around the idea that maybe there is a better way to hire people to work in government, and maybe we should be hiring people based upon their merit as opposed to supporting the winning candidate or winning political party. And so much like with a garbage can model decision-making that we had talked about last week, here you have your triggering event that then moves us from this era of spoils into this era of merit. There's a member of Congress by the name of Pendleton, who for many years was carrying around in his pocket a draft piece of legislation that would move us into an era of merit, where instead of hiring people based upon who they knew, we would hire people based upon what they knew, based upon their knowledge, based upon their qualifications. But he never really could get that introduced and get any momentum behind it in Congress until the triggering event of the assassination of Garfield. Once that triggering event occurred, he was able to introduce the legislation, get a groundswell of support behind the legislation, and that legislation then became known as the Pendleton Act. And the Pendleton Act was then passed in 1883. Pendleton Act said that we hire people based upon qualifications, we hire people based upon merit, and not only do we hire people based upon merit, but we also hire people and retain people based upon their performance. So we protect these federal employees, we protect these career civil servants from political influence. So not only are we not using politics in hiring them, but in doing their daily job, we are going to protect them from political dismissals and from political retribution. So this ushers in this whole idea of the era of merit. I see that in text chat, we've got a couple of comments. It's a mirror of the system going on right now. For example, Pete Buttigieg was also a presidential candidate for the last election, stepped down as Secretary of Transportation under Biden. Same can be said about a plethora of other gentleman deals for cabinet positions. Absolutely. And I think you make a very important point that the vast majority of people who work in the federal bureaucracy today get their jobs based upon merit, in that there is either an examination or an assessment of their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and that's how we hire career civil servants. But we have a hybrid system today whereby all of our departments and agencies are headed up by political appointees. Those political appointees get their positions very much in the same vein as an era of spoils. And so, yes, you do. And if you're running against someone for the presidency and that other candidate then decides to drop out and throw their support behind your candidacy, they're obviously going to expect something in return. They're going to expect a cabinet position. They're going to expect some type of high-level political appointment. That happens all the time. And it would be shocking, really, today to have a high-profile candidate drop out of a primary and support their opponent without the expectation that they're going to get something in return. So I think it's a really important point that, yes, we absolutely have a hybrid system of hiring today. The vast majority of people are career civil servants getting their jobs based upon merit, but the top cadre of people who are leading our agencies and departments, those are political appointees who get their jobs very much a la a system of spoils and a system of patronage. So very much is a blended hybrid type of system. That causes a lot of problems for managing and running organizations. If you are a political appointee, you are appointed by the president, you're probably appointed by the president to try and achieve the president's policy goals. If the president's policy goals are, for instance, the president doesn't support this agency or doesn't support this department, the president's probably going to appoint you with the assumption that you're going to dismantle this agency or this department from inside. Well, the career civil servants that populate about 99% of the positions within that department are probably not going to go along with that, because dismantling the department means they're going to be out of a job. So you have political appointees going in one direction, and you have your career civil servants going in a separate direction. If you're a career civil servant, you can just wait out that political appointee. When a political appointee is going to be there for maybe 18, 24 months, I'm here for a career. So I'm going to wait that person out. Hopefully, once that person is gone, there'll be an intervening election. Someone will get elected to office who I agree with more, and they'll appoint a political appointee who I can get on board with. So I'm just going to wait until that happens. And so sometimes it makes it very difficult to lead organizations. There's a good example of that back in the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan wanted to get rid of the Department of Education. And this is a recurring theme that we hear a lot from Republican presidential candidates. The Department of Education in 1981 was a relatively new department. The Carter administration had created the Department of Education out of an existing department known as Health, Education, and Welfare, or HEW. So what they did is he pulled the Education Department out, made its own standalone department, and then Health and Welfare then went together into what we know today as Health and Human Services. So the Department of Education had only been around for a few years, and the Reagan administration felt that it wasn't necessary and that was a waste of money, and that education should be something that should be the almost sole responsibility of state government. So President Reagan appointed someone as Secretary of Education who he felt would go into the Education Department and dismantle it from the inside out. Because, the best way to dismantle an organization is from inside the walls of that organization. What Reagan found, though, is that the person that he appointed, once they became Secretary of Education, they started to buy into the mission of the department, and they started to really feel that the department was a worthwhile entity. And they didn't dismantle it, and instead they worked to try and expand the Department of Education. So sometimes your political appointees don't do exactly what you would expect them to do, much like sometimes Supreme Court justices, when they are appointed by a president, do not do what the president expects them to do once they are on the Supreme Court. But we do have this hybrid system, political appointees at the top, and then the vast majority of federal employees as part of the career civil service. This idea of a career civil service that is somewhat divorced from politics. This is what Woodrow Wilson was talking about with his study of administration in 1887. This is something that we did not create in 1883 with the Pendleton Act. This is something that pre-existed the Pendleton Act. This is something that England had as their system of bureaucracy for many years before we ever adopted it. So we adopted the career civil service system from Britain. We then made some tweaks to it, as we've discussed earlier. We took the examinations and made them open and competitive examinations. We allowed for lateral entry into the career bureaucracy, some things that fit our political culture better than the British political culture. But we brought this system in from England. And in this system that we brought in from England, we were divorcing or trying to divorce politics and administration. We were trying to protect these career civil servants from political influences. The problem, though, is that in the Pendleton Act, we were providing these career civil servants with protection from politics. And so we made them career civil servants. They got their job based upon their qualifications, and they kept their job based upon how well they were performing their job, without respect to changing political winds. The problem, though, is that we were protecting them from politics, but we weren't really asking much of them in terms of not engaging in politics. And that's why we ended up getting in 1940 this thing called the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act is another piece of legislation that now requires that federal employees, career civil servants, while being protected from politics, may not engage in political activities while on the job. They also may not use public resources in order to campaign for political parties or for political candidates. So as a result of the Hatch Act, and then every state in turn passed its own little Hatch Act, public employees are limited in terms of just how political they can be while they are working on the public dime. So if you are campaigning for a candidate and you decide you're going to send out campaign emails to everybody who works in your department, that would be a violation of the Hatch Act. If you decide that you're going to use office letterhead in order to support a candidate, that would be a violation of the Hatch Act. If you're using time that you should be working on your public job in order to campaign for a candidate, that would be a violation of the Hatch Act as well. So now we are asking that these public employees avoid engaging in politics, and in exchange, we will then protect them from political dismissals and reprisals. So that creates this system of career civil service. And again, the vast majority of positions in federal government as well as in state and local government are what we consider to be career civil service positions. But if you fast forward then into the 1970s, so almost 100 years after the passage of the Pendleton Act, over that intervening 100-year period of time, Congress continued to pass little pieces of what we call piecemeal legislation, where they would make little changes and little tweaks to the career civil service system, small little tweaks here and there to the original Pendleton Act. And so we actually ended up having this accumulation of all these little piecemeal pieces of legislation affecting how career civil service operates at the federal level. So much so that a lot of career civil servants became very confused about what they could do versus what they could not do. So they knew they couldn't use their office resources to campaign, but could they wear a button at work? Could they have a bumper sticker on their car parked in the parking lot at work? There are a lot of questions about just where that line was in terms of politics versus administration. So in the Carter administration, we ended up getting this major piece of legislation known as the Civil Service Reform Act. And the Civil Service Reform Act was passed and signed into law in 1978. Again, almost 100 years after the original passage of the Pendleton Act. The Civil Service Reform Act was intended to try and make some sense of all these different rules and regulations and how we can enforce civil service principles across the federal bureaucracy. So the solution under the Civil Service Reform Act was to create entities, to create these agencies that could then enforce civil service provisions. Because before the Civil Service Reform Act, if you felt that your career civil service principles were being violated, it was very difficult for you to seek a redress for your grievances. Because we didn't have a lot of organizations that had the responsibility of protecting this career civil service type of system. So we created these different agencies, and you see them listed there on the screen for you, all by their acronyms. The first one is OPM, and OPM stands for the Office of Personnel Management. The purpose of the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, was to be the central clearinghouse for all matters federal employment related. So if an agency had a position, a vacancy to hire for, that position would then have to pass the position description through the Office of Personnel Management. The Office of Personnel Management would approve that description, would then advertise that position, would then solicit applications for that position. If there is an examination to be given to measure merit on the part of these applicants, that examination was created and vetted by the Office of Personnel Management. It was oftentimes implemented and executed by the Office of Personnel Management. Those scores were then tabulated by the Office of Personnel Management. And OPM would then create an eligibility list and provide that eligibility list of applicants back to the agency. And then the agency could only interview and hire from that eligibility list. Typically what they would do is they would take the top 3 or the top 5 scores on the examination. That's what's called a rule of 3 or a rule of 5. And then those are the only people on the eligibility list that the agency could interview and then hire from. So OPM really had this overarching responsibility for the vast majority of functions in the management of human resources at the federal level. It really was this central clearinghouse. Now today, OPM is still around, but OPM doesn't serve nearly as many functions as it did when it was created in 1978. There's been very much of a movement at the federal level to decentralize hiring from OPM down to the agency level. So OPM doesn't control every aspect of hiring like they used to. We've also moved away from examinations at the federal level. So we don't use the old PACE examinations that we used to use. And we replaced a lot of these examinations with an assessment of knowledge, skills, and abilities of those applicants. So everything's gotten much more decentralized than it was back in 1978. That was OPM's job, as OPM was supposed to be this central clearinghouse. Then a second agency that the Act created was this thing called the Merit Systems Protection Board, or the MSPB, the Merit Systems Protection Board. The Merit Systems Protection Board was there to do just what its name sounds like, to protect the merit principles for career civil servants. So if you were a career civil servant and you felt that your merit principles were being violated, you felt that you were being subject to political reprisals and political dismissal, you could then take your claim to the Merit Systems Protection Board. And the Merit System Protection Board, in very much of a quasi-investigatory type of process, would investigate your claim, would then adjudicate your claim. And if they found validity to your claim, they would then provide protections to you. And so it might be something such as, if you were dismissed for political reasons, for non-quality of work reasons, you take your case to the MSPB, they investigate it. If they agree with your claim, they can then order that you be rehired into your position and be provided restitution in terms of back wages. That's something the Merit System Protection Board could then order that this agency do. So if your merit principles would be violated, you would take your claim to the Merit Systems Protection Board. Within the Merit Systems Protection Board, there was this office known as the Office of Special Counsel. And the Office of Special Counsel, originally located within the Merit Systems Protection Board, was there primarily for what we know today as whistleblowers. So if you were working in an agency and you saw the merit principles of someone else, not you, but someone else in the organization, though those merit principles were being violated, you could blow the whistle, as we talked about back in our discussion of ethics and accountability. You could blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel. Office of Special Counsel would then go and investigate what you're blowing the whistle about, and would then, again, in a similar way as the MSPB, would then investigate and then adjudicate that claim. The difference, obviously, is with Merit System Protection Board, that's if it affects you directly. Office of Special Counsel, it doesn't affect you directly, but it's something that you're blowing the whistle on within your organization. The problem was the Office of Special Counsel was located initially within the Merit Systems Protection Board. That was a problem because the Office of Special Counsel did not have its own staff, did not have its own budget. So the Office of Special Counsel ended up with a huge backlog of cases, that just a years-long backlog of cases. It just couldn't get to all of these different claims. So in the Whistleblower Act in 1989, we pulled the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit Systems Protection Board and made the OSC its own standalone agency with its own budget and with its own staff. And that then helped alleviate some of this backlog of cases. Again, that was done with the Whistleblowers Act back in 1989. The fourth organization that was created in the Civil Service Reform Act was the Federal Labor Relations Authority, or the FLRA. The Federal Labor Relations Authority, the FLRA, is the corollary organization to the National Labor Relations Board. And you might be familiar with the National Labor Relations Board. The National Labor Relations Board oversees collective bargaining and unionization in private organizations. The Federal Labor Relations Authority does the same type of thing, but for federal agencies and departments. Just about every federal agency and department, their collective bargaining process is overseen by the FLRA. One exception to that is the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service is under the auspices of the National Labor Relations Board. The primary reason for that is that the U.S. Postal Service is a government corporation. So it is designed to act and operate a lot like a private sector corporation. So that's why its collective bargaining process is overseen by the NLRB. but pretty much everything else in the federal level is overseen by the FLRA. The Federal Labor Relations Authority very early on got into some hot water with public employee unions. And again, not to reference the Reagan administration too much, but in the Reagan administration, there was this very famous air traffic controllers strike. And there in the 1980s, air traffic controllers union went on strike. They couldn't come to an agreement in terms of their collective bargaining agreement. They wanted an increase in their wages. They wanted better working conditions and better working hours. So they go on strike. President Reagan said, if you go on strike, I will fire you, because being an air traffic controller is directly related to public safety. And we can't allow our air traffic controllers to go on strike because it would be a disaster for airline safety. Air traffic controllers went on strike, and the Reagan administration fired those air traffic controllers and then hired new folks to then replace those air traffic controllers. Air traffic controllers union took their case to the Federal Labor Relations Authority, said this is an unfair labor practice, or a ULP, that the federal government is not allowing us to unionize and to negotiate in good faith. The Federal Labor Relations Authority sided with the Reagan administration and said the Reagan administration had the authority to fire these air traffic controllers because it had a direct impact upon public safety. Air traffic controllers union, and more generally public employee unions at the federal level, obviously didn't like that decision from the Federal Labor Relations Authority, and it had a real chilling effect on the relationship between public employee unions and the FLRA. It took many years to kind of patch up that relationship between public employee unions and the Federal Labor Relations Authority. So at the federal level, we have this Federal Labor Relations Authority established under the Civil Service Reform Act. The corollary to the Federal Labor Relations Authority here in the state of California is what's known as CalPERB, the Public Employee Relations Board, CalPERB. And CalPERB does a lot of the same things for state and local unions that our friends at the Federal Labor Relations Authority does for federal employees and federal unions. And then the fifth organization, if you will, that was created in the Civil Service Reform Act was this thing known as the Senior Executive Service, or the SES. Now, as was pointed out in TechShed, as we had discussed before, we've got this major difference between political appointees at the top of our organizations and then the vast majority of career civil servants that are 98, 99% of everyone else who works in these organizations. And they are going off in different directions. So we've got this big gap between our political appointees and our career civil servants. The Senior Executive Service was designed to try and bridge that gap. And so what we did in the Senior Executive Service is we took the top 3 levels in the career civil service, we pulled those top 3 levels out and put them into this thing called the Senior Executive Service. When you joined the Senior Executive Service, it meant that you were eligible for bonus pay. So if your organization performed well and achieved its goals and objectives, or at least made progress on achieving its goals and objectives, then you, as a member of the executive, the Senior Executive Service in that organization, you would be eligible for bonus pay. We also gave Senior Executive Service members a lot more latitude and flexibility in moving from one organization to another. And so we made it much easier for you to move and keep your same position moving between organizations. The downside is that by getting this additional money, or the promise of this additional money, and more flexibility in moving between organizations, you had to give up a lot of your career civil service protections. So it became much easier to dismiss a member of the Senior Executive Service than a member of the traditional career civil service. So you give up a lot of your career civil service protections. In theory, it's a good idea in that it gives you this group of people who can bridge the gap between political appointees and career civil servants. The problem is that Congress never made good on its promises. It never made good on bonus pay. It promised bonus pay, it never provided that bonus pay. And so it led to high dissatisfaction rates among members of the senior executive service. But the creation of the senior executive service fundamentally alters the way in which our career civil service system looks and operates at the federal level. So at the federal level, this career civil service system that was first created back in 1883 in the Pendleton Act and then modified along its evolution throughout the years, this career civil service system at the federal level is what is represented by what we call the general schedule. So if you are a federal employee, a career civil servant, you are part of what's called the general schedule. The general schedule, let me show you on the next screen. The general schedule kind of looks like this, in that it's a position classification system whereby we break up positions in the federal bureaucracy according to different grade levels. And so you've got essentially now today 15 different grades, what are called GS1 through GS15 positions. Now, before the Civil Service Reform Act, we had 18 positions. It ran from a low of GS1 up to a high of GS18. But with that senior executive service, we took those GS16, 17, and 18 employees, and we placed them into the senior executive service. So now today, the career civil service is only GS1 through GS15. Then, like any other position classification system, which I'm sure you're familiar with in your local or state organization, there are then steps within each one of those pay grades, again, to recognize longevity in those types of pay grades. As you move up in terms of your pay grades, as you move to the right in terms of your steps, you move up in compensation. But compensation is tied directly to the nature of the job that you are doing. Again, this is meant to try and provide comparable worth, equal pay for equal work. Now, if you go into the federal bureaucracy with, let's say, a master's degree, an MPA degree, which usually can count for anywhere from 2 to 3 years of work experience. So you go in with an MPA degree and with, say, 5 years of relevant work experience, you're probably going to start out somewhere around the GS12 or so level, GS12 or GS13 level. If you just go in with an MPA without that relevant work experience, you might be lower, about a GS11 or so level. But that's about where you would expect to go into the federal bureaucracy with an MPA degree. Now, if you get up to the level of GS 13, 14, or 15 in the career civil service, you then have the opportunity to then apply for the Senior Executive Service Academy. At the federal level, we now have an academy to train people to then become part of the Senior Executive Service. So if you aspire to be in the Senior Executive Service, you can attend the academy. If you graduate from that academy, it could then make you eligible to get a position offered to you in the senior executive service. So in the career civil service today, we have GS1 through GS15 positions. The senior executive service then consists of 5 different levels, what's called an ES1 through an ES5. And then above the ES5 position will be your political appointees. And so it is very much of a hybrid system. We have spoils with our political appointees. We have merit-based hiring with our career civil servants. And then we've got these hybrid things known as senior executive servants who kind of have a little bit, share a little bit of the characteristics of both. So with this general schedule, with this career civil service system, obviously we have some major advantages that accrue to us because of having career civil service. We are hiring people based upon their qualifications, based upon their merit. So ostensibly, we will have higher levels of competence. We'll have less misfeasance going on in those positions. We will also, since we are divorcing politics from a lot of the decisions being made by these public administrators, we hopefully will then have less malfeasance and less corruption going on as compared to what we saw, especially in a lot of these political machines back in the 1800s and the early 1900s. The disadvantage of a career civil service system is it makes it much more difficult for us to reward performance. Higher compensation levels usually come from a reclassification of a position. So if you are working in a GS12 position and you want to get paid GS-13 money, that position is going to have to get reclassified from a 12 to a 13, which means there has to be some substantive change to the nature of the job and the duties that you are doing on a daily basis, and usually requires reclassification in order to move from one pay grade to another. Granted, having this step type of system, what we call a step and column system, will also incentivize longevity, because the longer you are there, the more steps you will move up, the more you'll move to the right and get higher compensation. But there aren't a lot of mechanisms for pay for performance built into a position classification system. So it makes it more difficult for us in the public sector to reward people based upon their performance than what we oftentimes see over in the private sector. So we have the system of position classification. We have primarily a meritocracy in terms of how we hire people to work as public administrators, with the recognition that it is a hybrid system and that our agencies and departments are still headed up by these political appointees. Regardless of the system itself and how the career civil service system works, the basic approach to managing human beings has tended to be a movement away from those classic organization theorists that we talked about a few weeks ago, Weber and Taylor and Gulick, and more of a movement toward a human relations, human resource management type of an approach, where we are very concerned today in human resource management with things such as motivation, employee satisfaction, helping employees self-actualize and develop their as human resources and develop through professional development processes. It's a much more human resources approach than it used to be back in the early 1900s and the late 1800s. So how do we then manage these human resources, and how do we manage them differently today than the way we may have managed them back in the early 1900s in the days of Frederick Taylor and Luther Gulick? Well, in your 577 course with Dr. Martin, you will talk about several different functions of the management of human resources, how we actually manage those human resources. Since we are a 500 course, and since we are a survey-based type of course, we're not going to get into a lot of the weeds of the different functions of human resource management, but I do want to make you aware of the major functions and what types of things we do in each one of these 4 functions of human resource management. So obviously our first function in managing human resources is the function of recruitment. We need to get people into these positions within our organization, and hopefully get people into our organization who have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities, the requisite skill set to be effective while on the job. For some of you, you've worked in the private sector before and now work in the public sector, or maybe vice versa. So you've had some experience working in both sectors. And if you compare the way in which you were hired in the private sector to the public sector, I think one of the things that will distinguish that recruitment process will probably be the amount of time that it took for you to get hired. We know that hiring in the public sector is a much more protracted, a much longer process than hiring in the private sector. In the private sector, we're hiring at-will employees, and so we have far fewer requirements we have to go through in the recruitment of individuals in the private as compared to the public sector. In the public sector, we are hiring people based upon merit. We're hiring career civil servants, so we have a lot more requirements that we have to adhere to. Because we are about more than just effectiveness and efficiency in the public sector, we are also concerned about things like social equity, social justice. We're concerned about representative bureaucracy. And as such, we need to make sure that we are recruiting the most diverse workforce we can possibly recruit. And so we have a lot of measures in place to assure that we have diverse applicant pools and that we are hiring diverse candidates from those diverse applicant pools. Here at the university, whenever we go out there to hire a position, whether it's a faculty position or a staff position, the position announcement needs to be reviewed by our Office of Equity and Diversity. We need to put together a recruitment plan that shows targeted recruitment, where we are targeting our recruitment So in our last faculty hire, we had targeted recruitment for the Women in Public Administration Association. We also had targeted recruitment with the National Association of Black Political Scientists. I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head. The chapters. There's a Hispanic Latino chapter in the American Society for Public Administration, and we did targeted recruitment through that organization, that chapter as well. I put together letters to send out to the chairs of public administration doctoral programs across the country that produced many graduates from underrepresented populations. And so we targeted those universities with our letter campaign. And you have to have a very diverse type of targeted recruitment, again, approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Once you get all your applications and you have your applicant pool, that applicant pool then again gets reviewed by the Office of Equity and Diversity. The Office of Equity and Diversity must approve that applicant pool before you can move into the vetting process. Once that applicant pool is approved, you can then go through the vetting process, and you then need to put together a list of, as we were called, semifinalists. That semifinalist list would then have to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity again. Then as you winnow that down into your 3 finalists that you're bringing to campus, those 3 finalists would then have to go through a final check with the Office of Equity and Diversity again to make sure that it's a diverse enough pool of 3 that you can go ahead and conduct those interviews. As Merrill was asking, why does it need to be a professor? I know most have PhDs. However, I heard that some get hired with masters as part-time. That's absolutely true. In order to be a tenure track faculty member in our department, you must have a doctoral degree, that PhD. That PhD can be in public administration, public policy, political science, or some other related field. All of our tenure track faculty members all have PhDs. We just have them in different fields. I think there are 3 of us who are political scientists. We have 1 who is an economist. We have 1 who is in public administration, or 2 in public administration now. And we have 1 faculty member whose PhD is in, I believe, organization, behavior, and leadership. So it's a PhD in public administration, political science, or a related field. There's also another doctoral degree in public administration known as a DPA, and a DPA stands for a doctorate in public administration. So it's not a doctor of philosophy degree, it's a doctorate in public administration. The DPA degree is a much more practitioner-oriented type of degree. So a lot of folks who have had a career in the public sector, they'll go into a DPA program because it's much more practitioner-related. And so typically our faculty members tend to have PhDs. Now, other programs will also hire DPAs as well. I know at USC, they have some faculty members who have DPAs who are what they consider their teaching faculty, and the faculty members with PhDs then are what they consider to be their research faculty members. But to be tenure track, full-time, yes, you need to have that PhD. The majority of our adjunct, our part-time faculty members have MPA degrees, and many of them do not have the PhD. Some do, but many of them do not. Dr. Williams is an example of a lecturer in our program who does have his doctoral degree. Dr. Caprillion, who no longer teaches the program due to health reasons, but he taught in our program ever since it started back in 1997, also had a doctoral degree. I'm trying to think of David Armijo, who will be one of the instructors in this program. He has an MPA degree, does not have the PhD, but he has over 30 years of experience running transit organizations across the entire country. And so usually our adjunct faculty oftentimes have the MPA degree, full-time faculty will have the PhD. But as you can see, you have to go through a lot of different steps in order to try and ensure the most diverse applicant pool possible, so you can make the most diverse hires that you can possibly make. And again, that's important for social equity. That's also very important for representative bureaucracy. We want our bureaucracy to represent the population that bureaucracy is serving. Now, sometimes that has been difficult, especially in terms of full-time faculty here in our program. We have been able to diversify our faculty with our last 2 faculty hires. Hopefully, if we get another faculty hire next year, the top priority will be another diversity hire for our next faculty member. But going through all these steps does mean that it's going to take longer for you to go through the recruitment process than if you were hiring in the private sector, but it's well worth it. Once you have that applicant pool, then you move into your second function, which is selection and allocation of work. You need to select the proper candidate to then fill your position. As we talked about in the past, the approach we usually used in selection was examinations. At the federal level, they used what was called the old PACE exam, P-A-C-E, the PACE exam. Most of those examinations have now been replaced by what we call KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities. So rather than having someone perform on an examination, we will instead make a more holistic determination of their resume, the knowledge, skills, and abilities as represented on their resume by their education and their experience and the skills that they have acquired. Some organizations will use what are called assessment centers. Assessment center is where you put together a simulated work environment. You'll then bring your finalists for the position into that simulated work environment. You will then assess how well they're doing the job in that simulated work environment. Obviously, if they perform well in that assessment center, you would hope they would perform well while on the job. We do know because of the Hawthorne effect from Elton Mayo's studies that people tend to perform better when they are being watched. And so sometimes people perform much better in the assessment center and then don't perform quite as well once they are hired into the position. We select the person who is most appropriate for the position. We then allocate work to that individual, and we allocate work to that individual. We typically do it through a work evaluation type of process. So in our third step here, once we have that person into the organization, we then have to look at the position itself and the work that is being done in that job or in that position. One of the primary things that we do in the management of human resources is we engage in what's known as a job analysis. A job analysis is when we look at each position in our organization and we deconstruct each position into its component elements. This probably sounds very familiar to you because this is a lot like what Frederick Taylor told us to do in his theory of scientific management. We study the positions, we look at all the component elements of those positions, we deconstruct those positions, and we analyze them. That's what's known as a job analysis. In a job analysis, we are analyzing each individual position. We don't only do that when we have a new person joining the organization, but we also do that whenever an employee asks us to reclassify their job. We do a lot of these things called classification studies. In a classification study, we will conduct a job analysis of a position to see whether or not the nature of that job and the tasks associated with that job have changed. Sometimes we'll have employees that will argue that they are working outside their job description. They're working outside of the parameters of their job, that the nature of their job has changed over the years, and so they need to have their job reanalyzed and reclassified into a higher level position. We've seen a lot of that in the wake of the pandemic. So people's functions kind of changed when they are working remotely. And now that people are starting to return to the physical space of work, they're saying, my job is different now than what it was before the pandemic. The way in which I interact with people is different now than it was before the pandemic. I'm doing a lot more virtual communication. I need to know a lot of these different platforms that I never needed to know before the pandemic. And so we have a lot of employees asking for those types of classification studies. So we do an analysis of each of those individual jobs. When we do the job analysis, and I've given you, I'm not going to go through it tonight for the sake of time, but when you look at our modules, if you take a look at the one for this week, the Managing Human Resources, you'll see that I've linked for you an example of job analysis and some of the things that we look at in a job analysis, things such as the skills required in the job, the specific tasks that are being done in that job, the amount of time that is spent on each of those tasks, the percentage of the job that is required in each one of those tasks. Those are all aspects of this thing called a job analysis. Once we have conducted a job analysis for each position within our organization, we can then take that information and use it to construct what's called a job evaluation. And the difference between a job evaluation and a job analysis is that a job analysis looks at each position in isolation. The job evaluation then takes the results of those job analyses, and we then start comparing positions to each other. And we do this type of comparison in job evaluation for the purpose of assigning compensation. This will allow us to then classify each of these positions, and then those positions that are classified at a higher pay grade obviously will get more compensation than those classified at a lower pay grade. One of the most common types of a job evaluation that we use to compare positions is what's known as a point factor evaluation. And again, in our Canvas site, I've given you a link so you can take a look at an example of a point factor job evaluation. But a point factor job evaluation, you'll again look at the skills required in that position, the amount of responsibility of the position, the amount of effort in terms of different types of tasks in that position, the conditions under which the work is being done, and you will compare across positions. And so you may have an example in the police department, you're comparing between a police chief position and a patrol officer position. Well, that police chief position, you probably have a lot more responsibility than you would have in the patrol officer position. That police chief is going to be responsible for the overall operations of the department. They're going to be responsible for interfacing with the media and with media inquiries. They're going to be responsible for coordinating work within the department. They're going to be responsible for probably managing a budget and soliciting resources for the department. They're going to have a different skill set and a different set of responsibilities than that patrol officer. But the police chief position may be one that does not bring with it a lot of physical threat, a lot of threat of harm. So the working conditions are different than the patrol officer. In the patrol officer position, there's probably a lot of physical threat of harm going out there on the streets, patrolling the streets on a daily basis. So the patrol officer position will probably score higher on threat on work conditions, but yet the police chief position will score higher on skill required, responsibilities required, scope of work required. And so when you balance it all out in this evaluation, the police chief position is probably going to come in at the top of your classification system. The patrol officer position will come in much lower, somewhere around the bottom of your classification system. But by doing this job evaluation, comparing jobs to each other, you can then classify them, create your position classification system, and then assign pay grades and assign compensation so that, again, we are seeing comparable worth, we're seeing equal pay for equal work. This job analysis and job evaluation creates your position classification system, and then it also creates your job descriptions, your position descriptions. Now, most of you in your agencies have a position description. I don't know if you look at it a lot, but you do have a position description probably for your position. A traditional position description will typically list, here are the duties of the job, here are the skills required, here's the amount of time or the percentage time you're spending on each one of these duties. And that's your basic traditional position description. However, today, a lot of agencies are augmenting that traditional position description by adding in performance measures as well. So expected performance levels. So, take a simple example of someone who's working a front desk in an office building. In their traditional position description, they may spend 40% of their time answering phones. They may spend 40% of their time directing people to offices, and they might spend the remaining 20% of their time typing correspondence. So that's a traditional job description. In a results-oriented description, or otherwise known as an ROD, in a results-oriented description, we'll not only say this is what the person is doing, but we'll say when they're answering the phone, that's 40% of the time they're answering the phone. The performance expectation is they always answer the phone with the same greeting, and they always refer people to the correct extension and provide the correct information. In terms of referring people to offices with 100% accuracy, they refer people to the correct office. That's a performance expectation. For typing correspondence, maybe it's typing 60 words per minute with no more than 1 error per document, or whatever the case may be. But you incorporate those performance expectations into this results-oriented description. Why is that so important? That is so important because it then forms the linkage between your evaluation, your job evaluation, and your performance evaluation. So with job analysis and job evaluation, we're looking at the job itself and what's going on in that job. In performance evaluation, we're looking at how well those tasks are being done. So you can look at job analysis and job evaluation as the what is being done in that job, and then the performance evaluation as how well are those jobs being done. Clearly, if an employee has a results-oriented description, they already know what the performance expectations are for their performance in that job, so that when they then move into performance evaluation, they are not surprised. So if they know that they're expected to have less than 1 error per correspondence, and then if they're averaging 3 or 4 errors per correspondence, they know they're not meeting their performance expectations. And so when they then get that negative feedback in their performance evaluation, it doesn't come as a shock. It doesn't create what we call that cognitive dissonance when they're hearing something that they weren't expecting to hear. Performance evaluation is, I would argue, perhaps the most important linchpin that holds the entire human resource management process together. Very famous article from an author by the name of Charles Fox many years ago, and I'll get the title wrong, but it was something to the effect of performance evaluations, the keystone of the human resource management process. And by that, he's referring to, if you think about an arch made of stone, the keystone is that top stone in the arch. You pull that keystone out and everything collapses upon itself. So he's arguing that performance evaluations, that's the keystone that holds the entire arch of human resource management together. If you don't do a good job of performance evaluation, you're not going to do a good job managing human resources. When we talk about performance evaluation, you'll discuss this quite a bit in your 577 class. Well, there are a couple different ways in which we can look at performance evaluations. We can look at the how do we do performance evaluations in terms of what type of performance evaluation we use. And then we can also look at how well we're implementing that type of performance evaluation. So on the screen there, I've listed some of the more common types of performance evaluations, and you've probably received some of these in your position. If you're a manager, you've probably filled out some of these for some of your employees. I've also included some links in our Canvas site for some examples, especially of graphic rating and what we call behaviorally anchored rating systems. But these are just some examples of different types of performance evaluations. A graphic rating system is one that we're very familiar with. It has your Likert ordinal response scale. So the excellent, good, fair, poor, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree. That's what we consider to be a graphic rating type of system. Graphic rating systems are great for supervisors because they're very quick and easy to fill out. They're sometimes not so great for employees because they don't provide a whole lot of formative feedback. A graphic rating system is really good for summative evaluations, not so great for formative evaluations when we're providing actual feedback to our employees. Also with the graphic rating system, there is the propensity for error, in that if a supervisor really likes the employee, you're going to end up with what you call the halo effect. And the halo effect, they will make that employee look angelic by selecting all the excellent categories. Sometimes you'll end up with what's known as a regression to the mean type of an effect. And regression to the mean, you will have a situation where the supervisor will just take the middle category, list the middle category for every single question. Again, that gives people room to grow. Well, it may not be the most accurate depiction of the performance of that individual employee. All kinds of errors that we can get with this graphic rating type of approach. Forced choice is a variation on graphic rating where you provide forced choice answers for the supervisor. So on a punctuality type of question, one forced choice could be the employee is never late for work. Another forced choice could be the employee is late on average 1 day per month. Another forced choice could be the employee is late on average 2 days per month. And so the supervisor then picks one of those forced choices. Obviously, if the right choices aren't listed, you're going to end up with measurement error as well. A ranking approach is just what it sounds like. It's really good for compensation. You have 10 employees, you rank their performance from 1 to 10 and then compensate accordingly if you have the ability to do that. Again, doesn't give you a whole lot of information. Someone will know that they're the top performer. Someone knows they're number 2, but we don't know the distance between number 1 and number 2. Most performance evaluation systems will have some essay component to them. Essay approach alone is usually not a great approach to use because there's a lot of subjectivity in the writing quality, the writing abilities of supervisors. Essay is usually something that's used in conjunction with another approach, such as a graphic rating. And typically we'll see graphic rating combined with an essay approach. The final one there, and I have an example for that for you up there on our Canvas site, is a behaviorally anchored rating scale. BARS, behaviorally anchored rating scale. In a behaviorally anchored rating scale, it's a lot like a grading rubric. So here are the behaviors that will lead to an excellent rating. Here are the behaviors that will lead to a good rating. Here are the behaviors that will lead to a fair rating, and so on and so on. A BARS approach is obviously better for formative feedback than any of these other approaches. However, it is also very time consuming and it takes a lot of thought on the part of the supervisor to determine what the behaviors are and how those behaviors link with each one of the performance categories. So it does take a lot of time and takes a whole lot of effort. The moral of the story here is what is sometimes more important than the type of format that is used. What is oftentimes more important is how it is done. And one important thing that we have learned in performance evaluation is if we can involve the employee in the development of the evaluation process, that employee will be much more likely to buy into the results of that evaluation process. If they see how the evaluation is constructed, they see how evaluations are being done, they're much more likely to trust the results of those evaluations. So it's very important for us to involve our employees in the performance evaluation process. If that performance evaluation then shows us that there is some deficient performance in the world of career civil service, we cannot just get rid of somebody because of a one-off poor performance evaluation. As you probably are aware of in your organizations, there's a lot of training and development that's being offered to our employees. So you recognize deficient performance, you then have to try and mitigate that deficient performance with the provision of training and development. You offer these training opportunities, then you reassess performance maybe 3 or 6 months later. If the performance is still deficient, then you have to provide more training and development opportunities, then you reassess performance, and so on and so on. In order to discipline and sanction an employee for poor performance, you must document not only the poor performance, but there is a pattern of poor performance, and that pattern of poor performance was attempted to be addressed through the provision of training and development. And again, just like the inclusion of the employee in performance evaluation, it's important to include the employee in the provision of training and development to allow that employee to participate in deciding what types of training and development, what types of skills that employee feels that they need to develop, not only to perform better in their job, but also to enhance themselves as human resources. The old adage in human resource management in the public sector is document, document, document. So you always have to document performance, document efforts to try and remedy that poor performance. If you don't have that documentation to fall back on, chances are you will then face a grievance, either that you are violating career civil service protections by disciplining and sanctioning an employee, or sometimes a grievance that will go to the public employee union. So it's important to go through the documentation process before you're able to sanction and discipline. But again, when you get into your 577 course, you'll go through these functions in much more detail. I just kind of want to introduce you to these functions of the human resource management process so you're aware of them now here in 500 before you then move on into 577. But undeniably, one of the major influences that we have seen on public employment has been the rise of public employee unions. Unionization is a reality in the public sector, sometimes more so than what we see in the private sector. In the public sector, over 35% of employees are unionized. They belong to some type of bargaining unit. Those bargaining units are engaging in some type of collective bargaining type of process. That number is much smaller in the private sector. It's down around 6 or 7%. So we have a lot more unionization going on in the public sector. Now, public sector employee unions have been faced with some issues of recent. One major issue that they are being faced with is the JANDA case. And the JANDA case has made it difficult for unions to use what are called fair share agreements with their employees. Typically, what has happened is that if you're a public employee and you're represented by a union, even if you do not belong to that union and you don't pay union fees, union dues to that union, you are still covered by the contract that that union is negotiating. And so therefore you are required to pay a fair share. Your fair share that you would pay would be less than what a member of the union would pay in terms of their union dues, but you are still required to pay this fair share. That has gone away for a lot of public sector unions. And so there's been a concern among public sector unions that they're not going to have the same resources that they used to have in order to try and effect political change and to engage in the lobbying process. But it is the new reality of a lot of public sector unions. But despite that, public sector unions are still very important in human resource management because of the role they play in creating this collective bargaining agreement. So as a public leader or manager, when you are managing human resources, you have to not only be aware of the career civil service protections that your employees enjoy, but also the protections that they enjoy from their collective bargaining agreements, from those contracts. So you not only have to know career civil service protections and regulations, but you also have to know the provisions of the collective bargaining agreement. Collective bargaining differs depending upon federal or state government and differs between states as well. Each state will have its own what's called scope of collective bargaining. There's what's known as the prohibited scope of bargaining, and issues in the prohibited scope of bargaining are issues that may not be collectively bargained over. So at the federal level, an issue that's within the prohibited scope of bargaining that may not be collectively bargained over is compensation. Compensation is determined by Congress, and Congress has a commission on compensation, meets a couple of times a year. That commission then makes recommendations to Congress about any potential increases in the salary levels of federal employees, but Congress determines the compensation of federal employees. So compensation is for the most part outside of the normal scope of bargaining. It is a prohibited item in the scope of bargaining. At the state level, you also have some issues that are outside of the scope of bargaining. I'll give you one example. Years ago, when I was working on my dissertation, I had a contract with the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations to do some research on local school districts and the impact of several different state and federal laws on local school districts. One thing I learned in Ohio is that school districts, privatization was not allowed as an issue for collective bargaining. It was in the prohibited scope of collective bargaining. So teacher unions could not negotiate and collectively bargain over privatization efforts that were being conducted by the school district. That was in the prohibited scope of bargaining. Then you have what's called the permissive scope of bargaining. These are issues that can be included in the negotiation process. So usually at the state level, compensation is usually within the permissive scope of bargaining, where it is in the prohibited scope at the federal level. But the permissive scope of bargaining, these are things that you may collectively bargain over. Then there's what's known as the mandatory scope of bargaining. And the mandatory scope of bargaining, these are issues that must be collectively bargained over. They must be included in the collective bargaining process. So the scopes will differ depending upon states. Some states historically have had very broad scopes of bargaining. Some states have had very narrow scopes of bargaining. So through this negotiating process, this collective bargaining process, employees will then organize into a union. They will then create what's called a bargaining unit. That bargaining unit will then hold an election, and they will then select their representatives who will go to the table and negotiate for that bargaining unit. So the negotiators for the bargaining unit will then end up going to the table to negotiate with the negotiators from the agency or from the department. In that negotiation process, the assumption is that both parties will negotiate in what we call good faith. They will engage in good faith bargaining. Good faith bargaining means that both parties are coming to the table with the goal of trying to come to an agreed upon negotiated settlement. There are several ways in which one or the other party can violate this assumption of good faith bargaining. And one example of a violation of good faith bargaining is what's known as regressive bargaining. Regressive bargaining is when, say, for instance, the agency says, we are going to put forth our first offer, which is a 3% salary increase on schedule, which means there's a 3% increase built into the position classification system. The union will come back and say, that's not good enough. We want a 6% increase. Well, that makes the agency mad. So the agency comes back and says, well, our new offer is only 2%. You can't do that. That's regressive bargaining. You cannot go back from your initial position. Your subsequent positions, your subsequent offers have to be better than the previous offer. If you go backwards, you're engaging in regressive bargaining. Well, so what? Well, what happens if someone is not engaging in good faith bargaining? Here in the state of California, either the bargaining unit or the agency could file an unfair labor practice with the Public Employee Relations Board, with CalPERB. CalPERB can then review that claim and will then make a determination if one of the two parties is not engaging in good faith bargaining. At the federal level, that claim would then go to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Well, more frequently than not these days, we are seeing the two parties being unable to come to a negotiated settlement. That's what's known as an impasse. When we have an impasse, we have an inability of the parties to come to a negotiated settlement, to come to a contract agreement, and we then have to find some way to try and break up that impasse, to try and resolve that impasse. There are typically three different strategies that can be used in what we call impasse resolution, to break the impasse and hopefully get an agreement on a new contract. One approach to impasse resolution is what's called fact-finding. In fact-finding, we will bring in a neutral third-party fact-finder. That individual will then come in, will then review the proposals of both sides, will watch the negotiations process, will then collect information and put all this information, all these facts together into a fact-finding report. The fact-finding report doesn't necessarily come to any major conclusions, but it includes all the information that this fact-finder has gathered in their time in these negotiations. It is non-binding. It is only advisory. This fact-finding report then, once it is produced, is then usually embargoed for a 2-week period of time, where we will only allow the two parties to see it for 2 weeks. And it won't go out to the public, and the media can't have it. Only the two parties are able to see what's in this fact-finding report. The reason why these reports are embargoed is obviously to try and facilitate agreement. Because if this fact-finding report comes in and the agency looks at it and it makes the agency look really, really bad, the agency is not going to want that report to go public. So that will put pressure on the agency to come to an agreement with the union in order to avoid this fact-finding report going public. But fact-finding is non-binding. Again, it's just the reflections and the observations of this neutral fact-finder. Another way in which we can deal with an impasse is what's called mediation. And the federal government has this organization called the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, the FMCS, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. The Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service consists of trained mediators who the federal government, if requested, can then send these mediators out into the field to then try and mediate the differences between the union and between the agency. When I was in college, just as an aside, one of my political science professors was a trained mediator with the Federal Mediation Conciliation Service, and he flew all over the country trying to mediate these types of labor disagreements. And we very rarely had class because he was always flying off to some other part of the country to try and do his mediation. Typically, mediation is non-binding in nature. It's just a way in which you can try and move the two parties closer together, but does not guarantee that you're going to end up getting an agreement. The third approach, which can help you get an agreement much better than mediation, is what's called arbitration. In arbitration, an arbiter, again, trained arbiter, will come in, will then look at the proposals that are offered up by the union and the proposal offered up by the agency, and then approach an arbitration known as a final offer arbitration. What the arbitrator will do is say, union, give me your final offer, your last offer. Agency, give me your last offer. The arbitrator will then look at those two offers and will choose one. The offer that is chosen then becomes the provisions of the contract. That is a binding approach known as final offer arbitration. If you absolutely need to get an agreement and you have to get this collective bargaining agreement put together now, you want to be 100% sure you're going to get it done, final offer binding arbitration will guarantee that you will end up with a collective bargaining agreement. The problem, obviously, is it may not be the agreement that you want. So if the arbiter selects the other side's final offer, obviously you're not going to be very happy with this final offer binding arbitration. But fact-finding, mediation, arbitration are just three ways in which we can try and resolve these impasses that are becoming more and more frequent in today's collective bargaining. So how do we really avoid these impasses from occurring to begin with? Using what's called interest-based bargaining, where both parties come into the bargaining process trying to find an agreement, understanding the positions of the other parties. Through interest-based bargaining, we can sometimes have an easier job avoiding this impasse. A lot of organizations have begun what they call labor management initiatives, or LMIs. And these labor management initiatives are essentially team building types of activities where we can get the members of the bargaining unit together, of the negotiators from the bargaining unit together with the negotiators from the agency, do some team building where you can build some trust and rapport between all the participants that will then be very fruitful once they sit down at the table. The more they trust each other, the more likely they are to come to an agreement. But again, your 577 class, you will talk more about some of these impasse resolution procedures and more about collective bargaining. If you are very interested in collective bargaining and the negotiation process, there is a course that you will be taking in this program known as Negotiating Dynamics. It's PPA 570. In that Negotiating Dynamics course, you will actually, if you haven't been involved in collective bargaining before, you will actually try your hand at some collective bargaining simulations, either being a member of the bargaining unit or being a member of the agency. And it's a very useful class where you kind of get a sense of how some of these collective bargaining processes actually happen in the public sector. So that's PPA 570 Negotiating Dynamics. That's one, the course that you're going to take much later on in the program. I think it's maybe in the fall of 2024, maybe is when you get that course. I know it's a lot of information, but I think we will cut that information at this point. I think that gives you more than enough information, number one, to be able to handle the human resources questions on the final assessment, as well as number two, to prepare you well once you get to your PPA 577 course. If we stop now, we take a little bit of a break, then we'll still have enough time, I hope, to then get through our discussion of the management of financial resources. So it looks like it's about 7:38. Well, it just clicked over at 7:39. So let's go ahead and take a break. Let's say we'll take a break until 7:50, if that's okay. Come on back at 7:50, and then we'll answer any questions we have about managing human resources. And then we'll move into discussion of the management of financial resources. We'll talk about different types of budgets, different types of approaches to budgeting. We'll talk about where revenue comes from, tax and non-tax revenue. and a little bit about debt and deficits as well, again, to get you ready then to succeed in your next class, which is 555. And I have designed it so that we can finish up tonight on management of financial resources as a really nice segue then into your next class in 555. So yeah, it seems like you're on the in the central time zone, 9:39. So I spent many years in the central time zone, so I'm very familiar with it. Okay, yeah, let's go ahead and take a break. We'll come on back at 7:50 and we'll talk about management of financial resources. Okay, it is 7:50, so we are back from break. Hope everyone had a good 10-minute break. Sorry about that, but we do have so much information to cover tonight, and I do apologize. I know I'm talking a lot. I talk a lot in this class. That's it's not gonna be like that when we have organization theory together. It won't be like that when we do intergovernmental relations either. It's just kind of the nature of the beast with this class, and that there is so much information to cover, and we cover so many different topics to get you ready then for the remainder of the courses in the program that there's a lot of ground cover. And so you'll really be able to have more discussion and get into a lot more depth on all these topics once you get into your future core courses. So any general questions about what we covered in the first half of class tonight with the management of human resources? Again, a lot more discussion you'll be able to have once you get into 577. And one of the ways that Dr. Martin likes to teach a 577 course is he does a lot less lecturing, a lot more of your participation. And so I know he likes to have students present information from each of the different modules of the course. And so it'll be a lot more exchanges than what we were able to do in the first half of class tonight. But for our second half of class, we're going to cover our last main topic for this course, which is the management of financial resources. And again, it works out really well because it's a nice segue for 2 weeks in the future when you will be in your PPA 555 Public Budgeting and Finance course. Since you are moving into public budgeting and finance in the very near future, we're going to just really hit the highlights and the tip of the iceberg with a lot of these different topics, just to kind of get you ready then for your 555 course. And we're not going to get into a whole lot of detail on a lot of these things. I have provided some links for you in that module of the course in Canvas, so you can take a look at what different types of budgets look like. We're just kind of going to cover those budgets in passing, but we're not going to go through examples. You can take a look at those examples at your leisure, and then that will help you then get ready for discussing those budget formats in much more in-depth fashion once you get to 555. So to kind of lay the groundwork to get you ready for 555, I think we really need to have a good common assumption of what a budget is and a definition of what is a budget. And I think we all have a good sense of a budget. Some of you may manage budgets on a daily basis in your organization. Some of you may not have managed budgets before, but you still have a good idea of what a budget is. Budgets are very much prospective documents that in a budget, we are looking into the next fiscal year. And we're saying, this is what we are spending our money on, and this is how much money we are spending. So in a traditional budget, we're saying for next fiscal year, this is what we're spending our money on, and this is how much money we are spending. So it's very much a statement of dollars and cents for the next fiscal year. You'll see once you get into your 555 course that whereas the budget is a prospective document looking at the next fiscal year, another very important document in budgeting is what's known as the annual financial report. It used to be called the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. Now most organizations are referring to it as the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. So instead of a CAFR, they're calling it an ACFR. But in a Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, that is what we refer to as a retrospective document. So in your budgeting course, you'll see that if you want to know what's going to happen, what we think is going to happen in the next fiscal year, we look at the budget. If you want to see what actually happened in the last fiscal year and how we spend our money in the last fiscal year, you'll look at your annual comprehensive financial report. Budgets are prospective, comprehensive financial reports tend to be retrospective. And those are the two documents that we can use to learn just about everything we need to know about the finances of a city or a local government. So it's very much a statement of how much money we're spending, what we're spending the money on next year. However, I also like to define budgets as being statements of priorities, that a budget will tell us what our priorities are as a society. Because with budgeting, we always have infinite demands and finite resources. And trying to meet those infinite demands with those limited finite resources, we have to make decisions. We have to prioritize one area of spending over another. So in our budget, if we're spending more money, we're increasing the education budget, but we're decreasing the budget for social services. That gives us some insight into what we are currently prioritizing and our priorities as a society or as a community. So a budget really is that statement of priorities. When you view a budget as a statement of priorities, it becomes a much more significant, much more important document than if we're just looking at it as a statement of dollars and cents that we'll be spending in the next fiscal year. So as you move forward into your budgeting course, think about budgets not just as a statement of dollars and cents, but also think about budgets in terms of being statements of the priorities of a society. There are two basic types of budgets. There are operating budgets and capital budgets. Operating budgets are for those day-to-day expenditures that we're going to make to keep our government, our organizations running on a daily basis. Capital budgets are for those very long lifespan, high price tag, non-recurring types of items. So a recreation center, an upgrade to our storm sewer system, a fleet of new police vehicles. That's going to all be found in your capital budget, whereas your salaries and your supplies that you need on a daily basis, that will all be found in your operating budget. State and local governments maintain a separate operating and separate capital budget. The federal government usually does not. The federal government usually throws everything together into a unified approach, primarily because the federal budget is so large that a single $500 million capital project is not going to make a big difference in the grand scheme of things at the federal level. However, if you're a city and you've got a $500 million capital expenditure, that's going to blow a hole in your budget if you drop that into your operating budget. So usually segregate that out from your operating budget into your separate capital budget. Separating those capital expenditures, those long lifespan, non-recurring types of items, into putting those into a separate capital budget makes sense, obviously, not just because we don't want to blow a hole in our operating budget, but we also, by most state constitutions, need to avoid a deficit. That most states require their state and local governments to maintain a surplus or at least break even, so that revenues are at least the same as expenditures. A deficit is an imbalance between revenues and expenditures in one given fiscal year. And most state constitutions preclude running a deficit. So that $500 million capital project cannot go into your operating budget because that would put you into deficit. So that's why you then segregate it out into your capital budget. Another good reason why state and local governments tend to maintain separate capital budgets is in terms of decision making. Last week, we talked about those 4 different decision-making models, and we said that usually in budgeting, we tend to use the incremental model, and then we make small adjustments, small changes from one year to the next. That is true for our operating expenditures. However, for those bigger decisions like that big capital project, we want to be more rational in nature. And so by putting these projects in a separate capital budget with a separate decision-making process, we can be more rational because we are spending a lot more money on a project that's probably going to be with us for many, many years, if not for generations. So again, a lot of good reasons why state and local governments separate out operating and capital budgets, whereas the federal government does not. So in your 535 class, you will talk about the process of creating a budget and what goes into the creation of budgets. we won't go into a lot of detail here tonight for the sake of time, but regardless of whether we're talking the federal or state or local level, your basic budget process usually consists of 4 different phases: preparation, formulation, execution, and evaluation. In that first stage, preparation, before we can know how much money we are spending, we need to know how much revenue we are raising, because the amount of money we can spend is going to be directly contingent upon the amount of money we have been able to raise in revenue. So the preparation phase usually occurs well before the fiscal year starts. Now, at the federal level, the federal fiscal year runs from October 1st until September 30th. Here in the state of California, for most state agencies, the fiscal year runs from July 1st until June 30th. So typically here in California, we're on a different fiscal year than the federal government. In some other states use the calendar year, and they'll run their fiscal year from January 1st until December 31st. So it all depends upon the state. But at the federal level, the preparation phase is going to occur long before the new fiscal year begins on October 1st. In the preparation phase, you have organizations such as the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, the Joint Committee on Taxation. Those organizations will work on putting together revenue forecasts, where they will put together forecasts of how much revenue they anticipate we will get in the next fiscal year. OMB and CBO are the 2 major organizations that put together these revenue forecasts. Sometimes those revenue forecasts are much different from each other. They use different methodologies, different approaches, and so the OMB revenue forecast oftentimes tends to be a lot more optimistic than CBO's forecast. OMB's forecast tends to be more optimistic because OMB serves the president and wants to achieve presidential policy goals, whereas CBO serves Congress. And so the OMB forecast tends to be a lot rosier, as we say, and much more optimistic than what we tend to see from the Congressional Budget Office. So in addition to putting together forecasts of the amount of revenue that we anticipate generating, we will then also have those organizations put together expenditure estimates. Expenditure estimates is they will ask the question, if we were to continue with our current level of service delivery next year, how much would this cost us a similar level of service delivery? Because as we know, inflation, we're all very familiar with inflation today and just how high inflationary increases have been. But because of inflation, it'll probably cost you a lot more next year to do the same thing that you did this year. So we see organizations like the Office of Management and Budget putting together what they call their current service estimates. How much will it cost us to just maintain our current service level in the new fiscal year? Here in the state of California, the corollary organizations are, the corollary to the Office of Management and Budget here in California is the Department of Finance. So the Department of Finance will do some similar types of things for the governor that the Office of Management and Budget does for the president at the federal level. The Legislative Analyst Office, the LAO, is the corollary to the Congressional Budget Office here in the state of California. The Legislative Analyst Office will put together analysis of how much we're going to need for next year in terms of revenue. We'll put together estimates of how much different pieces of legislation will cost. Whenever we see an initiative go onto the ballot and people are voting on an initiative, there'll usually be an LAO estimate of how much this initiative will cost if this initiative is passed by the voters. So the LAO, the Legislative Analyst Office, is kind of the corollary to the Congressional Budget Office at the federal level. So we've got all this preparation going on, putting together our revenue forecast, putting together our expenditure estimates. At the federal level, the Office of Management and Budget will then put out a request for budget requests from the different agencies and departments. All the agencies and departments across the federal government will put together their requests. We'll then send those requests to the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget, once they receive those requests, will typically reduce those requests, will make cuts to those requests, and then those reduced requests, those revised requests, will then become part of the executive budget. That's all going on in preparation long before the fiscal year begins. At the federal level, whenever the president puts their budget together and transmits that budget to Congress, usually at the beginning of February, we then shift from preparation to formulation. So formulation phase begins whenever Congress receives the president's budget, usually in early February. Here in the state of California, formulation will start whenever the state legislature receives the governor's budget, usually sometime in mid-January. So whenever the legislature receives the budget, we then begin the second phase of the process known as formulation. At the federal level, whenever the president's budget goes to Congress, it goes to the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee. The House and the Senate Budget Committee are the central starting points for the executive budget once it hits Congress. The House and the Senate Budget Committees will then pass these things called budget resolutions. And it's what's known as a concurrent resolution on the budget. And this concurrent resolution on the budget, put that in text chat, concurrent resolution on the budget typically needs to be passed by the House and the Senate Budget Committee no later than April 15th. I know it's kind of ironic, that's tax day for most people, but that's when the budget resolution is due. The concurrent resolution on the budget will establish the maximum amount of money that Congress can spend across all the different programmatic areas. So here's the maximum amount that can be spent on education policies. Here's the amount that can be spent on health and human services. Here's the amount that can be spent on defense. Here's the amount that can be spent by the Department of State. And so it'll set spending caps, if you will, for each one of the different areas of spending in the federal budget. That concurrent resolution on the budget is not a budget. It is just a recommendation for this is the maximum amount that you should be spending in these different areas. Then this is where the process gets kind of convoluted. The process then splits into two different parts, depending upon the type of money that's being spent. There is what's called the discretionary spending process, and then there's called the mandatory spending process. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So if Congress can cut a program and spending on a program directly, that's what's considered to be discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is supposed to go through the appropriations process. So you'll have the Appropriations Committee in the House and the Appropriations Committee in the Senate. Each of those appropriations committees will have 12 different subcommittees, one subcommittee for each programmatic spending area. So there'll be an education appropriation subcommittee, a defense appropriation subcommittee. Those subcommittees will start working on the appropriation bill in their area of jurisdiction. They will hold hearings, they will mark up the bill. Then that bill then goes up to the Parent Appropriations Committee. The Parent Appropriations Committee will then hold hearings, it will mark up and make amendments to the appropriation bill. And then those appropriation bills are ready to go to the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate. In the House, before a bill can go to the floor of the House, it must then go through a Rules Committee. So it goes to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee will pass rules determining how that appropriation bill will be discussed on the floor, the amount of time for discussion and debate, the amount of amendments, if any, that are allowed on that bill. All of that will then be passed in a rule by the Rules Committee that will govern how that appropriation bill gets discussed on the floor of the House. In the Senate, for a bill to go to the floor of the Senate, it gets there through what's known as a UCA, which is a unanimous consent agreement. Trying to type and talk. Unanimous consent agreement. The unanimous consent agreement basically means that all senators agree to allow this bill to go to the floor of the Senate, which is not as difficult as it sounds. Because if you stop someone's bill from getting to the floor of the Senate, they're going to probably stop your bill. So there's a lot of what we call log rolling, this quid pro quo, where it is surprisingly much easier than you would think for these bills to go to the floor of the Senate. But that's what's called the appropriations process. Now, the House and the Senate will be considering 12 different appropriation bills. The versions that come out of the House and the Senate, as we know, according to the Constitution, before they can go to the president, they must be in identical format. They must look identical. So then you'll have conference committees that will then hammer out the differences between the House and the Senate version. They hammer out the differences, then the uniform versions go back to the House and the Senate floor for final passage before those appropriation bills then go to the president. And there are 12 appropriation bills that eventually should be passed by the House and the Senate and then subject to presidential signature. That's for discretionary spending. Then you have another category of spending called mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is spending that Congress does not have direct control over changing. So things such as interest on the national debt. Congress has borrowed the money, Congress has to pay off that debt. They must make those principal and interest payments. Congress cannot directly reduce those payments because once the debt is incurred, the debt is incurred. Another example of mandatory spending, something like an entitlement program. An entitlement program is a program where people are legally entitled to the benefits of that program if they meet the eligibility requirements. So think about something like Social Security is an entitlement type of program. If you are the mandatory or the retirement age and you are fully vested in Social Security, you are then legally entitled to your Social Security benefits. If Congress wants to spend less money on Social Security, it has to go through the authorization process and change eligibility requirements. So Congress can raise the retirement age up to 70 years old or 72 years old. That makes fewer people eligible for those benefits, which means Congress will then be spending less money on Social Security benefits. So anything that's mandatory spending goes through what's called an authorizations process and goes through a set of authorizations committees to look at eligibility requirements and whether or not those requirements need to be changed. So we got two different processes, discretionary spending and mandatory spending. The goal is that before September 30th, before the end of the fiscal year, that all 12 of those appropriation bills will be passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the president to begin the new fiscal year on October 1st. That hardly ever happens. You may get 2 or 3 of those appropriation bills passed and signed by the president, but once the fiscal year begins and all these other appropriation bills have not yet been signed by the president, you do not have legal authority to spend money as a federal agency. So instead, what Congress will do is they will pass what they call continuing resolutions. And a continuing resolution will just say, we will continue to fund the operations of this department or agency at 80% of what we funded at for this period of time last year, giving us some extra time and buying some time for us to get the appropriation bills passed and signed by the president. So it's just Congress buying time. Continuing resolutions are temporary. They usually last 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks or 4 weeks. Whenever they expire, they then have to be renewed. And Congress will do that all the way through maybe December or January until finally either Congress or the president says no more continuing resolutions. At that point, you then have 2 choices. Either a government shutdown, where you have to shut down the operations of all those agencies and departments that don't yet have a budget in place, or you take all those unapproved appropriation bills and you squeeze them all together into this mammoth piece of legislation known as an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. Let me see if I can get that right. Okay, I can take off. Oh. My typing is not good tonight. Oh well. You get the idea. Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. I know it's not spelled correctly, but just trying to get it in text yet. Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, or an OBRA, goes by the acronym OBRA. This is typically how we tend to do budgeting at the federal level, not by passing 12 separate appropriation bills, but rather by passing these mammoth OBRAs. In these OBRAs, we dump everything in there, including the kitchen sink, in order to get members of Congress to support. And so a member of Congress wants to get a bridge named in their honor. We'll put that in there to get that member of Congress to support this Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. It leads to a whole lot of overspending, leads to a whole lot of what we refer to as pork barrel spending in the budgeting process. In the state of California, the process looks somewhat different. So the governor's budget goes to the state legislature in mid-January. The state legislature works on the executive budget through February and March, April, but really doesn't finalize anything until it gets this, what's called a May revise around the middle of May. So around the middle of May, the Department of Finance will put together this thing called a May revise, where we will revise all the assumptions that the governor's budget was built upon back in January. So in that May revise, we may see that revenues are running behind what we thought they would be. So revenues are less than what we projected. So in that May revise, the governor will revise their budget in order to cut it to make it match the lower level of revenues that the state is actually generating. Then based upon that May revise, then the state legislature will really go to work finalizing the state budget. The state budget then needs to be passed by June 15th, signed by the governor by June 30th for the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. However, in California, because we have that limited amount of time between the May revise and June 15th, there's not a whole lot of time to hammer out details in how this money is going to be spent. So the budget that's passed by the state legislature is basically general parameters. Then throughout the month of July and August and into September, when they're not in recess, the state legislature is then passing these things called trailer bills. Those trailer bills here in the state of California will then spell out exactly how this budget will be implemented, how this money will actually be spent. So what are the true implementation requirements, the eligibility requirements for how all these dollars and cents will be spent in the fiscal year. So sometimes local agencies, you may have experienced this in your agency, you're waiting. The fiscal year begins on July 1st, but you have not yet gotten the trailer bill passed to govern how you are supposed to spend this money. So you're kind of holding in abeyance, waiting for this trailer bill to be passed before you know exactly the parameters of what this money can be spent on. The trailer bills are very important bills here in the state of California to really spell out exactly how the state budget is going to be executed, how it's going to be spent. But in theory, at the federal level, execution then begins at the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st. Here in California, execution phase begins at the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. Execution is actually spending the money. So at the federal level, and here in California, it's that 1 year in which we're actually implementing the budget and spending the money. In some states, they use biennial budgeting. And so they do their budgets on a 2-year basis. And so execution actually runs over a 2-year period of time. But here in California, at the federal level, it's a 1-year execution phase. Once that fiscal year ends, then you move into evaluation. In an evaluation, you go back, you have to audit the books. This is where we have those types of audits we talked about last week, things like financial legal audits. Did we spend the money in the legally appropriate manner? And performance management audits asking the question, how well did we spend the money? But those are the 4 basic phases of the budgeting process: preparation, formulation, execution, and evaluation. To get through these 4 phases, it means that to get through all 4 phases for one fiscal year budget, that may take us 3 to 4 years just to get through all 4 phases for one fiscal year budget, which means that we have multiple fiscal years overlapping upon each other. When we are in the execution phase for the current fiscal year, we are in the formulation phase for the next fiscal year. And we're probably in preparation for 2 years into the future. And we're in evaluation for the last fiscal year. So we've got all these fiscal years all overlapping on top of each other, just in different phases of the budgeting process. So what this means is it means that budgeting can be a very complex endeavor, both at the federal as well as the state level. There are people who have served in Congress for 35, 40 years who still cannot tell you all the intricacies of the federal budgeting process. You can create an entire degree program on federal budgeting and still have information left that you have not yet covered. It's a very complex, very convoluted process. But what do budgets look like? Once those budgets come out, what do they look like? Well, budgets can take on different types of formats. And the 4 budget formats we cover here in this class that you'll cover again in your budgeting class are formats such as the line item budget, performance-based budget, program-based budget, what we call zero-based budgets. Now, I have links for examples of each one of those budgets in our Canvas site. For the sake of time, we're not going to go through those examples here, but kind of more of a 30,000 foot level. Let me just kind of tell you about how those budget formats work and some of the differences between them. The line item budget is the one that we are most familiar with. A line item budget is oftentimes called an object of expenditure budget. We'll list what the money is being spent on and then how much money is being spent on that line item, on that object of expenditure. A line item budget is very good for the purpose of control. It allows us to control how much money we're spending and what we are spending that money on. But it doesn't give us a lot of additional information. We don't have enough information to manage how well we're spending the money. We just know this is what we're spending it on, this is how much money we're spending. So these line item budgets, because they don't provide us with a lot of information, really lend themselves to incremental decision making. This is why most budgeting is incremental. So line item budget is a very traditional type of budget. It's been around for many, many years, extremely popular, especially at the local level of government. A second budget format is what's known as a performance-based budget. Now, here at the performance-based budget, we start to add in some performance indicators into our line item budget. So we're providing some indicators of how well we are spending the money. And when I used to teach the budgeting course, I used a textbook by John Mikesell. And John Mikesell used to be a faculty member at Indiana University. So he dealt with a whole lot of snow in Bloomington, Indiana. So the example he liked to use in his textbook was a performance-based budget for a snow removal program. And so the snow removal program has its primary goals of removing snow from the roads. And hopefully by removing snow from the roads, you'll reduce the number of accidents where snow is a contributing factor. So in the performance-based budget example, he'll not only list, here's the amount of money that's being spent on snow removal, but he will list the activities that will be done with that money. So X amount of money will be spent on plowing streets. X amount of money will be spent on salting streets, because you put the rock salt on the streets, the rock salt will then melt the snow. This is just another way to clear snow. And so you have a salting program and the amount of money being spent on salting the streets. You'll take a look at the number of miles of roads that have been plowed, the number of miles of roads that have been salted, and then a per unit cost per mile for how much it's costing you to clear each mile of road. Then in terms of your outcomes, one outcome could be the number of accidents where snow is a contributing factor. If we're doing a good job and we're spending this money effectively, then the number of accidents where snow is a contributing factor should be going down and should be less than what it was last year. The more money we spend, the more lane miles we plow and salt, the fewer accidents that will occur. Another indicator could be citizen satisfaction. How many complaints do we get from citizens that their streets have not been plowed or their streets have not been salted? So again, you're building in these performance indicators into what's called a performance-based budget. Usually the performance-based budget, it will have a traditional line item component, and then it will have those performance indicators built into it. Performance-based budgeting became very popular in the 1950s, then kind of went dormant for a while, and has now really enjoyed a nice renaissance, especially at the local level, since the 1990s. And so it's not terribly unusual to see some variation of a performance-based budget used in local government budgeting. A performance-based budget goes beyond just an emphasis on control, and it helps to emphasize the management feature of a budget. So now we are using our budget to help manage the operations of our organization, because we have that additional information to do so. A third type of budget format is what's known as a program-based budget. Now, a program-based budget emphasizes the planning feature of budgeting. It helps us plan the operations of our organization. A program-based budget is going to look a lot different than a line item or performance-based budget. In line item and performance budgeting, you organize your budget according to the individual unit or department or division. So you'll have a police department budget. You'll have a fire department budget. In a program-based budget, you organize your budget according to the program and the goals of the program. So instead of organizing according to the police department, excuse me, a fire department, you can organize your program budget around a program such as the protection of persons and property. That's a program that both the police as well as the fire department contribute to. So the activities of the police department that contribute to the protection of persons and property, all those activities get budgeted together underneath that program. All the activities in the fire department that contribute to protection of persons and property all get budgeted together with those police activities, all under that rubric of protection of persons and property. So it's a completely different way of organizing our budgets, organize them according to a program as compared to organize them according to unit or department. So it allows you to plan how what the police department does combines with what the fire department does to help you protect persons and property. And then the fourth budget format that you'll cover in your 525 class is what's called zero-based budgeting. Zero-based budgeting is where we go back and we re-justify why we are spending money on programs. You look at the lowest level in your organization where budget decisions can be made, and you call those lowest levels in your organization where budget decisions are made decision units. Each one of those units will then put together what we call decision packages, different ways of spending the money. Each one of those decision packages will then list out the consequences. So one decision package may say, if we spend 100% of what we spent last year, here are the consequences. We'll be able to serve fewer people than last year because of the increase in inflation and the cost of doing business, but it won't be all that far off the amount of people we were able to serve last year. Another alternative could be we are going to spend 110% of what we spent last year, so an additional 10%. Well, if we spend this additional 10%, the consequence is we will be able to serve X number more citizens and provide them with X number more services. Those are the consequences. So you provide all these different packages, send those packages up through administration, and then they get ranked and prioritized. The highest prioritized packages then become part of your organization's budget. It's a much more rational approach to putting a budget together, a much more bottom-up type of comprehensive approach to budgeting. So whereas line item budgeting really emphasized incrementalism, performance, program, and zero-based budgeting are much more about introducing rationality into your budget decision-making process. So the big so what question is, if you use zero-based budgeting, if you use program-based budgeting, chances are you're going to have much bigger departures in what you are spending as compared to previous years, as if you were using a line item budget. In a line item budget, your changes from one year to the next will be very small. In a program zero-based budgeting approach, your differences from year to year will be much larger. Again, if you are interested, I've provided some links to examples of each of these budget formats. But again, when you get to 525, you will cover them much more in depth and be able to see additional examples of what those budget formats look like. But before we can decide how much money we're spending and what we're spending our money on, obviously we're going to have that money to spend, which means you're going to have to generate revenue. And so the other side of the equation from expenditures is revenue. So there are two different broad categories of revenue generation. There's revenue from tax-based sources of revenue and from non-tax sources of revenue. Tax-based sources of revenue, you're familiar with the big three forms of taxation: property taxes, income taxes, and sales or consumption-based taxes. In public budgeting, you'll talk about these different tax sources and their advantages and their disadvantages, which is very quickly in terms of an overview. Property taxes are what we consider to be a wealth-based tax, in that the amount you pay is indexed to the value of your home. It is based upon your ability to pay. And an indicator of your ability to pay is the value of your home that's being taxed. Income tax is also an ability to pay type of tax, where we index your ability to pay to your adjusted gross income. Sales taxes are what we call benefits received types of taxes, in that you pay a sales tax for the benefit that you are accruing from consuming some type of a good or service. If you choose not to consume that good or service, then you do not pay the sales-based, consumption-based type of tax. Sales taxes, consumption-based taxes, tend to be much more regressive than income taxes. And whenever we design a tax, we have to be mindful of how regressive or how progressive that type of taxation is. A regressive type of tax is a tax that imposes more of a burden on lower income individuals than upper income individuals. So a sales-based tax can be very regressive because people with lower income levels have less disposable income than their counterparts with higher income. Lower income individuals have less disposable income because once they have purchased the staples of life, they have less money left over for other purchases. So unless you exempt the staples of life, things such as food, maybe up to a certain amount in terms of clothing, prescription medications, unless you exempt those staples of life, your sales tax is going to end up being very regressive and having a bigger impact on lower as compared to upper income individuals. The income tax is usually seen as a much more progressive type of tax. Because in our income tax, both at the federal as well as here in the state of California, we have a marginal graduated income tax system, in that you pay taxes based upon your marginal tax bracket. It's a marginal tax bracket because your tax bracket doesn't apply to all the income that you've earned. So up to a certain amount, up to $10,000, you'll be at the lowest marginal tax bracket. Then for every dollar you make between $10,000 and $45,000, you'll be moved up to a higher tax bracket. Then for every dollar from $45,000 up to, again, I'm just making this up to $90,000, you'll then be taxed at a different tax bracket. Having that graduated marginal tax bracket system really does reduce the burden on lower income taxpayers, thus making the income tax, at least in theory, a much more progressive form of taxation. The primary vehicle for tax generation for most local governments still tends to be the property tax. And that's because the property tax is a very stable source of taxation. For the most part, property values continue to increase with a few differences here and there. So when the market fell out, the housing market, the bottom fell out back in 2007 and 2008, property values went down, but they very quickly recovered and went to higher levels than they had been before the crash in the mid-2000s. Now we're seeing property values, because of interest rates going up, we see property values going down a little bit. They will recover, they will go back up again. And if you look at the overall trend tends to be a very much of an upward trend in terms of property values. The higher property values go, the more property tax revenue there is for local governments to collect. So property taxes tend to be a very stable, very adequate source of revenue for local governments. In your budgeting class, you will talk about the unique way that we tax property here in the state of California, primarily through Proposition 13. And Proposition 13 introduced an approach to property taxation known as the welcome stranger approach. And that's a pejorative term, but what's known as the welcome stranger approach, whereby we tax property whenever it changes hands. And so whenever a parcel of property sells, it then gets revalued at the sales price, and that then becomes the new assessed value of that property for the purposes of taxation. That causes a lot of problems in terms of equity, in that if you have two identical properties located next to each other, one property was purchased in 1975, The property next door, which is identical, was purchased most recently in 2020. In 1975, that parcel property was purchased for $50,000. In 2020, that parcel property was purchased for $1.2 million. Those two taxpayers are going to have wildly divergent tax bills because of the much higher assessed valuation on that 2020 property as opposed to the one that sold back in 1975. That's a result of Proposition 13. What Proposition 13 does do is it keeps people from being taxed out of their homes. It limits tax rates to a 1% property tax rate and limits the percentage increase in the valuation of your home for tax purposes to a maximum of 2% per year. So the benefit is for homeowners, obviously, but it also has this equity issue as well and reduces the amount of money available through property tax revenue for local governments. One of the things that we saw after the passage of Proposition 13 in 1978 is local governments in California started to shift away from property tax revenue and start to shift more toward non-tax sources of revenue to replace a lot of this tax revenue that was lost as a result of Proposition 13. So today, the average city in California, and this is more so true in Northern California as compared to Southern California, but overall, the average city in California generates more revenue from user charges and user fees than it does from traditional property taxes. And that is a change that was fueled directly by Proposition 13. So since the average city in California generates more revenue from non-tax sources of revenue, you will also learn in 555 about these different sources of non-tax revenue. Two main sources of non-tax revenue are what are called user charges and user fees. And admittedly, a lot of local governments will use the term charge and fee interchangeably. But there is a difference between what is considered a user charge and what is considered a user fee. Charges are usually attributable to the consumption of some type of service. So someone consumes a service such as a utility service, then pays a charge based upon the amount of that service that that person consumed. Fees are typically not associated with the amount of a good or service that's being consumed. Fees are typically associated with things such as licenses. And so you'll get a hunting license. You have to pay a fee for that hunting license. You get a driver's license. You pay a fee for that driver's license. You want to open a franchise. You have to pay a franchise fee for the privilege of opening that franchise. Licenses allow governments to control how behavior is engaged in. Because if you engage in behavior that you're not supposed to engage in, you lose your license. Those licenses, though, when they're associated with fees, can also generate a good source of revenue for local governments as well. So governments tend to get more money from user charges and user fees than they typically get from the traditional source of property tax revenue. So it's important to learn about those non-tax sources of revenue, and you will cover those in your 555 course as well. One of the most contentious discussions that we tend to have in public budgeting is about debts and deficits. Debts and deficits are related, but yet different topics. A deficit is an imbalance in revenues and expenditures in a given year. So in one given year, if our expenditures exceed our revenues, we have a deficit. The accumulation of those deficits, if we run deficits year after year after year, the accumulation of those deficits will contribute to what we call our long-term debt. Debt is long-term. Debt is money that we have borrowed that we then have to pay off in the future. So deficit's an imbalance between revenues and expenditures in one given fiscal year. Debt is money that we have borrowed and we are paying back over a longer period of time. There is long-term debt and there is short-term debts. The primary example of long-term debt, especially at the local level, is what's known as a bond. So if we want to go out there and we want to construct a new recreation center that's going to cost us $80 million, we're probably going to issue a bond. We're going to borrow that $80 million by issuing a bond. We'll then repay that money over 20 or 30 or 40 years. There are some good reasons why we borrow money to pay for these capital projects. If we had to raise taxes in order to generate $80 million all at once to construct this recreation center, that would end up being cost prohibitive for our residents. There's just increased tax rates too high. Our residents would not be able to tolerate that high of a tax increase. However, the tax increase we need in order to pay off this $80 million over a 30-year period of time will be much smaller and much easier for our taxpayers to handle. Also, this recreation center that we are building, hopefully that recreation center is going to be there for decades, and it will serve multiple generations of city residents. So why would it be fair for people who happen to live in the city in the year in which that center is being built to have to pay the entire $80 million cost, and then future generations then become free riders and get all the benefits without paying the cost? If we can spread the repayment over a 30 or 40-year period of time, we can then achieve what we call intergenerational equity, and that every future generation that uses this facility will also have to bear the burden of paying for its construction. So there are a lot of good reasons why we issue these bonds as long-term debt. There are a lot of different types of bonds that you'll cover in your budgeting course. Just 3 general types of bonds that we'll cover tonight, just kind of get you started, get you ready for 555. General obligation bonds, revenue bonds, and double barrel bonds. A general obligation bond is oftentimes the most common type of bond that we see local governments issuing. A general obligation bond is what we refer to as a full faith and credit type of debt. Full faith and credit. Full faith and credit general obligation bonds mean that the city promises investors that it will use whatever resources it has at its disposal in order to repay this debt. So if the city needs to raise taxes, it will do so to repay the debt. If the city needs to lay off employees, it will do so to save money to then use that money to repay the debt. It will do whatever it needs to do to repay investors for their investment. Because of that, general obligation bonds offer very low risk to investors. Investors know they're going to get their money back. We know with investments, there's a relationship between risk and reward. The lower the risk, the lower the reward. And so investors get very low risk. It's a very sure investment, but it means they're going to get very little return on their investment. Interest rates, what we refer to in bonds as coupon rates, so we usually call them coupon rates when we're dealing with bonds. These interest rates, these coupon rates tend to be much lower with a general obligation bond than they will be with any other type of bond. So governments can save some money with low interest rates by issuing general obligation bonds. One of the problems with the general obligation bond is that states will limit the amount of general obligation debt that local governments can incur. So in order to issue a general obligation bond, if you are going above your state mandated cap, you are going to have to go out there and get voter approval. To get voter approval for a general obligation bond, typically you need to get a supermajority here in California. You need to get 2/3 of the voters in order to agree to issue that type of a general obligation bond. That can be extremely difficult. Hard enough to get a simple majority, much more difficult to get a 2/3 majority. So if a general obligation bond is not possible, another type of bond that you can use is what's called a revenue bond. Revenue bonds are not full faith and credit. Revenue bonds are repaid with the revenue that is generated from the facility that's being constructed. So essentially with this recreation center, we are going to be able to charge a membership fee to people who use this recreation center. We then collect that membership fee. We use it to not only pay for the operations of the center, but we also then use it to repay the debt. So when the repayment of the debt is captured through revenue generated by the facility, we can then use a revenue bond. Good thing about a revenue bond is it's not full faith and credit. We're only securing it with the revenue that we are generating. The bad news is it's a much more speculative type of debt. There's a higher risk for investors, which means they expect a higher return, which means the interest rates are going to be higher. on a revenue bond than they would be with a general obligation bond. We can only use a revenue bond if the revenue is sufficient to cover both operating expenditures as well as repayment of the debt. A middle ground where we can kind of combine the best of both worlds is what's called a double barrel bond. In a double barrel bond, part of the issue will be general obligation, part of the issue will be revenue in nature. The nice thing is that since part of it's general obligation bond, the interest rate will be lower than what it would be with a revenue bond. So the interest rates kind of fall between general obligation and revenue bonds. And it's also nice to use if you don't have enough revenue to completely pay off the debt, but you do have enough revenue left over after operation costs to be able to at least defray some of the debt. And so you would use this combination known as a double barrel bond. There are a lot of other types of bonds that you'll learn about in your budgeting class, things like lease rental bonds, sale leaseback bonds, capital appreciation bonds. That are kind of beyond the scope of what we're able to do in this class, but you kind of get the idea about bonds being used as long-term debt, typically to pay for the construction of these capital projects. Governments also engage in short-term borrowing, whereas long-term borrowing is known as a bond. Short-term borrowing is usually known as a note. Notes are issued that are usually less than 1 year in maturity, and they're oftentimes issued for offsetting an operating deficit. And so if you get to the end of the year and you realize that your expenditures are exceeding your revenues, you could borrow money in the short term to offset that deficit and then pay that money back in the beginning of the new fiscal year. Sometimes we use notes to borrow money quickly to get started on a project. And so while we're waiting for our bond proceeds to come in, we'll issue a note, which will allow us to get started on the initial construction on our recreation center. So there are some good reasons to issue short-term debt. If you're issuing short-term debt, though, to cover an operating deficit, you're doing that year after year after year, obviously that's a red flag in terms of the fiscal solvency for your city. But again, short-term debt usually takes the form of these things that we refer to as notes. And you'll learn more about specific types of notes that are issued when you get into your budgeting course. So let's wrap up this overview of the management of financial resources by looking at how we have made changes to the process of constructing public budgets. One of the things that we have realized, both at the federal as well as the state level, is that we have struggled mightily with two different parts of budgeting. One thing we have struggled a lot with is getting our budgets done on time. We rarely get budgets done on time at the federal level. Now, here in California, we're much better recently at getting budgets done on time. And our ability to get budgets done on time is the function of two different factors. One is we revised Proposition 13 a few years ago, whereby we no longer need a 2/3 vote of the state legislature in order to pass a budget. We can now pass budgets with only a simple majority. If we want to raise taxes, we still have to get a supermajority, but to pass a budget, we only need a simple majority. So that made it a lot easier in California to pass a budget. Secondly, here in California, we have Democratic supermajorities in both the Assembly as well as in the Senate, and we have a Democratic governor. Now, take the Senate, for example. Out of the 40 seats in the California State Senate, 32 of those seats are held by Democrats, only 8 seats are held by Republicans. So not only is it a supermajority for the Democrats in the California State Senate, it's an 80% majority in the California State Senate. And the California Legislature Assembly is not far behind in terms of the Democratic supermajority. So those two factors have really converged to make it much easier for us to get budgets done on time here in California. But not only have we struggled to get budgets done on time at the federal level, but the second major issue we've struggled with is deficits, trying to avoid deficits where our expenditures exceed our revenues. It's something we have dealt with mightily at the federal level. If you look at every budget year from 1969 until the current year, we have run budget deficits in every single year with the exception of 2 years, 1999 and 2000. Those are the only 2 fiscal years where we had a surplus. Every other year, we had a deficit. So since we can't get budgets done on time, and since we're running deficits, we have tried over and over again to try and reform our process of budgeting, to try and get our budgets done and to avoid deficits. 3 examples of these attempts to try and reform the budget process occurred in 3 separate decades. So go back to the 1970s. In the 1970s, we were not getting our budgets done on time. And by the mid-1970s, we had run 5 years of budget deficits. That sounds kind of quaint to us today, only 5 years of budget deficits. But we had 5 consecutive years of budget deficits. So Congress decided it wanted to pass this thing called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. So it passes the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. It does a lot of different things to reform the budgeting process. Some of the major things it does, it changes the fiscal year to run from October 1st to September 30th. It creates these House and Senate budget committees that we talked about earlier as the central starting point for the president's budget when it arrives in Congress. It tried to eliminate discretionary spending that happened outside of the appropriations process. Discretionary spending that happens outside the appropriations process is known as backdoor spending. And it was an attempt to try and limit and eliminate backdoor spending. And it was also an attempt to try and increase the power of Congress in the federal budgeting process. By the 1970s, the president had come to dominate Congress in budgeting. The president puts their budget together and transmits that budget to Congress. In doing so, it gets to frame all the issues, and then Congress has to work within those parameters established by the president. The president had the Office of Management and Budget that he had been using for many, many years as a major resource for the president in putting together all these revenue forecasts and these expenditure estimates. Congress wanted to be more of a player in the process. So Congress established its own organization, this Congressional Budget Office, to kind of serve as a counterweight, a counterbalance to the Office of Management and Budget. Congress was also angry with the Nixon administration. Now, presidents do not have a line item veto. Governors do, presidents do not. A line item veto allows the chief executive to veto out specific line items within budgets and appropriation bills. Since presidents do not have a line item veto, President Nixon used a strategy known as presidential impoundment as kind of a de facto line item veto. So what Nixon would do is he would receive an appropriation bill, and if he disagreed with a program or an area of spending in that appropriation bill, he would then impound the funds. And there are a couple different ways to impound the funds, not to get too much in the weeds on this, but one way is he could defer the spending and just say, I'm not going to spend the money now. I'm going to wait and spend it maybe in 3 or 4 weeks because I want to sync up the spending of the money with the revenue that we receive as the federal government. But I will spend it eventually. They're just deferring it initially. Congress wasn't all that worried about deferrals. What Congress was really worried about was what were called rescissions. So a rescission type of impoundment is when President Nixon would say, I disagree with this program and I refuse to spend the money. I don't care that Congress appropriate this money, I'm refusing to spend it. I am the chief executive, I am not going to allocate this money to federal departments and agencies. That's what really ticked off Congress. So Congress wanted to try and control the president's impoundment powers by creating a one-house veto. Essentially what Congress did is it said if the president is doing a rescission type of impoundment and refusing to spend this money can be released with a majority vote by either the House or the Senate. So either one of the bodies can vote to release this money. So it's called a one-house veto. But guess what? That's unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court decided that was unconstitutional. We have a veto process in the Constitution. We have a process in the Constitution for overriding a presidential veto. Constitution is very clear that to override a presidential veto, you need to have a 2/3 vote of both the House and the Senate. And a one-house veto is unconstitutional. So away went that part of the Budget Impoundment Control Act. Even after the Budget Impoundment Control Act was passed in 1974, year after year, we continued to run deficits. Year after year, we continued to have trouble getting the budget done on time. And so all these reforms we tried in terms of reforming the process did not achieve the goals of getting the budget done on time and avoiding budget deficits. So in the 1980s, we tried again, and Congress passes a series of two pieces of legislation known commonly as Graham-Rudman-Hollings 1 and 2. Number 1 in 1985 and number 2 in 1987. And Graham-Rudman-Hollings, named after the three gentlemen you see on the screen: Phil Graham on the left, a Republican from the state of Texas; Warren Rudman, an eventual independent from the state of New Hampshire; and Fritz Hollings, a Democrat from the state of South Carolina. I know it sounds strange to say a Democrat from South Carolina these days, but they actually existed back in the 1980s. So in Graham-Rudman-Hollings in 1985, Congress established what they called maximum allowable deficits. So they said, let's set up a timetable. And every year in our timetable, the maximum allowable deficit will go down each and every year until eventually, after about 20 years, the maximum allowable deficit will be 0. We will have eliminated deficits. Makes sense. For every year that Congress is unable to hit their maximum allowable deficit target, we will then end up starting a process known as, and this is your 25-cent word for the night, sequestration. Process known as sequestration. We will require the president to sequester or make across-the-board cuts until we can get our amount of money we're spending in line with our allowable deficit target for that year. Problem with Graham-Rudman-Hollings 1 in 1985. Number one problem is that it was, again, unconstitutional. So just like the Budget Impoundment Control Act was unconstitutional, an aspect of Graham-Rudman-Hollings is unconstitutional as well. Under the sequestration process in Graham-Rudman-Hollings 1, the person in charge of sequestration to monitor the president was this person known as a Comptroller General, who was the head of the Government Accountability Office, at that point known as the General Accounting Office. Problem is, the General Accounting Office was a congressional organization, and the Comptroller General was an employee of Congress. So Congress put one of its employees in charge of monitoring the president, a clear violation of separation of powers. So they had to redo Graham-Rudman-Hollings into Graham-Rudman-Hollings 2 in 1987, remove that provision, reset their timetable, and it still failed. 1990s, we're still running deficits every year, and those deficits are getting bigger and bigger. So to make a very long story as short as possible, in the 1990s, we tried it again. And this time we tried it with what's called the Budget Enforcement Act. The Budget Enforcement Act, instead of looking at deficits, it focused on the cause of those deficits, which was spending. If we could control runaway spending, we would then, by definition, end up reducing and eliminating deficits. So in the Budget Enforcement Act, what Congress did is it established 3 different categories of spending: domestic, defense, and international. It then set up firewalls between those categories, meaning that you could not rob from domestic programs to pay for increases in defense spending. You could not rob from defense spending in order to pay for more domestic programs, and vice versa. So it created firewalls between these 3 different categories. It also created this system known as the acronym PAYGO, P-A-Y-G-O. And PAYGO stands for Pay As You Go. That if you want to impose some fiscal discipline, we cannot continue to create new programs and then borrow money to pay for these new programs. If you want to create a new program and you want to spend money on that program, you must find that money from another program within that same category. So if you want to create a new domestic program, that's all well and good, but you got to pay for it through eliminating or reducing another domestic program. You pay for these new programs as you go. The combination of the Budget Enforcement Act, along with Balanced Budget Acts in 1993 and 1997, along with a very quickly growing economy in the Clinton administration. And if you remember, in the Clinton administration in the 1990s, we had the dot-com boom. We had Silicon Valley, and we had all these internet companies that were just taking off and experiencing astronomical growth in their revenues, which led to a large increase in growth in income tax revenue being collected by the federal government. So when you combine the fiscal discipline you get from the Budget Enforcement Act and the Balanced Budget Acts of 1993 and 1997, together with increased tax revenue, the result of that is the elimination of deficits. And so by 1999, we had, at least on paper, eliminated deficits. Once again in 2000, we ran a surplus and had eliminated deficits. Then September 11th happened. After September 11th happened, and we had the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you had this incredible increase in the amount of spending, especially in terms of those military operations. And we are right back into deficit spending again. And we are still in deficit spending today. So we have been unable to get back out of deficit spending. So from 1969 until 2022, we've run a deficit every single year with the exception of 2 years. Well, so what? What does all this mean? This means that the elimination of deficits and the imposition of fiscal discipline is not so much a matter of procedural changes as it is a matter of political will. If we don't have the political willpower to make the difficult decisions in terms of cutting spending and increasing revenue, we are never going to get control of the budgeting process. Changing the process alone is not good enough to get the job done. We have to have people in decision-making positions who have the political willpower to make the difficult spending cuts along with the difficult revenue increases in order to get our budgeting process under control. It's much more of a matter of political will than it is a matter of procedural reforms. So where does that leave us in terms of budgeting and finance, in terms of the future of budgeting and finance? Where it leaves us changes with each passing month. If I was going to talk about this last year, I would say at least here in the state of California, the future of budgeting is pretty bright in that California had not really experienced the true impact of the pandemic because of all the federal money that was flowing into states. So for California, the fiscal picture looked really good. This year, the fiscal picture does not look nearly as good. And a lot of people in Sacramento are scared to death about what the May revise is going to look like in about 5 weeks or so. Revenue projections are running well behind where we thought that they would be. And there's a chance that we may end up seeing a budget deficit this year, anywhere from about $20 to $35 billion, which is a major budget deficit. So a lot of the programs that were augmented and enhanced last year, I think those programs are going to end up being cut. And we may end up with a very difficult budget picture this year. And again, I think it's because this year we are really finally starting to feel the true fiscal impact of the pandemic, not impacts that have been masked by this flow of federal money that's been coming out of Washington, D.C. for the past 3 years. So I wish I had better news about the future budgeting, especially here in California, but hold on tight, buckle your seatbelts, and we'll see what happens in the May revise. But all indications is the May revise may be a very, very ugly situation in a few weeks. So that's my basic introduction to you about public budgeting and managing financial resources in the public sector. Again, just to kind of get you prepared and get you set for your PPA 525 course, which starts up in a couple of weeks with Dr. Williams. You get a whole lot more flesh on the bones on a lot of these topics in that course with Dr. Williams. That wraps up all the information we typically cover. I know on the syllabus we had measurement of performance as a final topic. That's not covered on the final assessment. And so I think for the sake of time, we'll cut that topic. I don't think it's essential, especially to prepare you for your future core courses. So we'll just end it here with our management of fiscal resources. Questions? Any questions or observations or comments on either the management of human resources or management of fiscal resources? I apologize for talking so much, but I really did want to get through all this information so you have everything that you need in order to do a good job on that final assessment. Since we're so efficient tonight and we did get through our last 2 topics, it will not necessitate a Saturday session. So I think we are safe not holding our live Saturday session, so we can cancel that. And instead, we will just give you that time to work on your final assessment, which will then be due by 11:59 on Saturday evening. Let's see, in text chat, do you think we will ever get out of the federal budget issues given the fiscal and monetary spending during COVID? I almost said no. I don't want to be too negative, but it's going to be extremely difficult. The federal government spent so much money during COVID. It's going to be really tough. And what's really going to be even more difficult is the partisan divides that we see in Congress. And we have these safe districts that were created through political gerrymandering. I'll try not to get on my soapbox again like I always do, but for years, political gerrymandering has been the bane of the existence of American democracy. And it's made for these safe districts whereby Republicans don't have to worry about running in a general election. All they have to worry about is winning their primary. Democrats, they don't have to worry about their general election either. All they have to worry about is winning their primary. Whenever you're appealing to primary voters are much more ideological extreme than general election voters. So Republicans have to move to the right in order to try and win their primaries. Democrats have to move to the left to try and win their primaries. As Republicans move to their right, Democrats move to the left. It hollows out the middle ground, and it makes it much more difficult to find agreement, especially about contentious issues like budgets. There's a famous book that was written many years ago that I used to use in my budgeting course when I taught budgeting. It's called The New Politics of the Budgeting Process by Aaron Wildofsky. And Aaron Wildofsky in the book really bemoaned the fact that the partisan divides in budgeting had become so great, and the chasm between the two political parties had become so great. And that was a book that was last published in the 1990s. And so if he thought the chasm was great in the 1990s, I would shudder to think what he would think about the chasm that we see in Congress today between the two parties. And so when you have that great chasm ideologically, it's going to be even more difficult for us to come to agreement on budgets. And when you add in all the federal spending during COVID, like you say in text chat, I think it's going to be extremely difficult for us to ever hope to either eliminate deficits or even get our appropriation bills passed on time. I think we're going to continue using omnibus budget reconciliation acts. Now, the new Republican majority in the House, one of their major initiatives when they came in is they said they were going to eliminate the use of omnibus budget reconciliation acts, and they wanted to go back to the way in which the process was supposed to work, which is the passage of those 12 appropriation bills. Whether or not they're able to accomplish that, we will have to wait and see. But chances are, even if they're able to get those 12 appropriation bills out of a Republican-controlled House, you're not going to be able to get them out of a democratically controlled Senate. And you're certainly not going to be able to get them signed by a Democrat in the White House. And so again, I really just see us continuing to go in these different directions, and it's going to be difficult for us to gain control of the federal budgeting process. Again, I don't want to depress you at the end of the class. So walk away with this class and think, all hope is lost. I think if we can get a handle on districting, if we can find a way through these independent redistricting commissions to get away from the two major parties controlling districting and engaging in political gerrymandering, I think that's our path out of this. But some states have independent redistricting commissions. Here in California, we have one of those, but a lot of states don't, and they put it squarely in the hands of their state legislatures. And when the state legislatures are controlled by conservative Republicans or by liberal Democrats, makes it very, very difficult to have any districts that are not considered to be safe districts. Yes, Esmeralda, for clarification, we don't really have a need to meet on Saturday for class, so instead we'll have that time afforded to you to work on finishing up Canvas essay number 5, as well as your final assessment. Okay, as you work on your final assessment, if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be available all week long via email. Again, you've got your Canvas essay number 5 and responses along with your final assessment due by 11:59 on Saturday. I will then spend the next couple days after that working on getting everything evaluated. I will try and have your final grades into the system no later than at the very latest Tuesday, April 18th, if everything goes well, and then that will allow you to then move onward and upward to your next course. I will check in again with Dr. Williams and see when the syllabus will be available for budgeting, and then make sure that Geraldine gets that syllabus out to you so you can see the topics and the textbooks and get a head start on all that good information. All righty? Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure working with you. Again, I apologize for the lecture-heavy orientation of this class, but we'll get away from that in some of our future courses and certainly get a whole lot more discussion and a whole lot more participation in those future courses. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate it, and have a good week. And I will talk to you again in the very near future. So take care, everyone.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good week.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you,
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
everyone.